Audible Frontiers presents Infection, written by Sean Schubert, narrated by Daniel May.
Part 1, Chapter 1. I love coming up here. Alaska is my favorite place in the whole world. Little Martin Hauser truly meant what he said when he repeated his revelation for what seemed to be the 100th time. He loved coming to Alaska with his family. He was the only one in his class who had ever been to such a distinctly different place. At first, he didn't really know what the big deal was. It was just a place, after all. The more that he heard people talk about this place, however, the more he accepted that Alaska held some kind of magic. His family had been coming to Alaska every 2 or 3 years since he was born, meaning that he was now in Alaska for his 4th time. They stayed in a beautiful deluxe cabin. There were 3 bedrooms, a large great room with an enormous stone-faced fireplace, a beautiful solarium off the main room, and indoor flushing toilets. This was an amenity that his mother had always remarked as the most important feature of the cabin. Personally, Martin didn't see the big deal. He was able to do all that he needed outside in the woods, and usually did. It had just become a part of the grand experience for him. There was a loft area above the bedrooms, electricity from a very large diesel-powered generator housed in a small shack outside, and even a satellite dish for television. It was better than their house. This was an especially good year for Martin because he had been allowed to invite a friend. The decision was, not surprisingly, made the moment the opportunity was presented to Martin. He knew exactly whom he would like to bring. Danny Mahoney. It was Danny Mahoney's first trip to Alaska, but given that he was only 10 years old, he was years ahead of most visitors to the state, who often didn't find time in their lives to visit the state until after retirement. He and Martin were best friends from playing on the same soccer team for the past 2 years. Martin's family, all 5 of them, including Martin, were nice and generous and had readily welcomed Danny to travel with them, all except Alec, Martin's older brother, that is. Martin's dad, Mr. Hauser, was an ordinary man of ordinary height, ordinary weight, wore ordinary clothes, had an ordinary job, and led an ordinary life. Most people would consider him average, if not a little less than average, in all things in life. He was, however, pleasant and willing to spend time with Martin and Danny and any other kids that might be around, something many adults weren't willing to do. Danny liked Mr. Hauser and trusted him. Mrs. Hauser, Ginny, was anything but ordinary. She was about as tall as her husband, but about twice his size. She was loud and easily excited, and always laughing with loud, contagious storm bursts of laughter, full of life and enthusiasm. She always smelled sweet and inviting, a combination of her ample perfume and the treats that were always in her pockets, purse, hands, or mouth. At soccer games, she always brought the best after-game snacks and was known for that by all the other kids on the team. Martin's brother, Alec, was older by 5 years, tall, thin, and athletic. He played basketball all the time and teased Martin and Danny for being too short to play basketball and for having had to settle with playing soccer, of all things. In public, Martin and Danny both chafed at the insults and resented Alec, but in private, they both secretly admired him and looked up to him. That admiration made it that much harder to accept Alec's barbed comments. Alec didn't wear really baggy clothes like a lot of his friends wore, or, more to the point, his parents wouldn't let him wear clothes like that. He compromised, though, by wearing a series of loose-fitting licensed replica basketball jerseys and buying his jeans a size too big. That was as baggy as it got with him, which was just fine as far as he was concerned. It was harder to play a sudden impromptu game if he was wearing baggy jeans. Martin's sister, Julie, or Jules, as everyone called her, was 2 years younger than him. Alec had overheard a conversation once between his parents and some family friends in which Jules was referred to as a mistake. Jules was small and pretty, with longish dark hair and blue eyes that usually precipitated second and sometimes a third looks from people. Her eyes were absolutely electric with life. Jules usually tagged along with Martin and Danny, which was just fine with them. She made the two of them 3. The 3 of them were currently running a roughly cut path through small trees and thick brush. Below them and to their right was a gray and gravelly creek bed through which coursed an equally gray and gravelly, near-frigid stream of melting glacial water. To Martin, the only one of the 3 of them who could credibly claim to remember, it seemed that they should have already found the glacier. Had it melted? Was it all gone? He bragged about his experiences on and around this small arm of the Crenshaw Glacier. Now, with the glacier gone, would it appear that he had been only telling stories? Lies? Nervously, he started chewing on his lower lip as he ran. Where was it? And then, there it was. Part of it, anyway. He could see a narrow spit of ice that thrust itself into the flowing water, as if it were the glacier's tongue lapping at the currents. Around a bend in front of them, he could finally see a substantial sea of dirty, frosty white against a backdrop of green and brown. When they got closer, they could see the deep blue hue of the dense ice as it refracted the sun's light. "What's that smell?" crowed Jules through her sudden grimace. It was an awful odor, worse than the manure smell from back home in Minnesota, and worse than that rotten fish smell at the piers down in Seward. A faint breeze helped to thin it enough for them to continue on. Danny suggested, "Smells like something died. We probably ought to watch out for bears." Almost on cue, both Martin and Danny took their small pocket knives from their front pockets and bared their shiny blades. Jules picked up a stick and held it at the ready. "What's that?" asked Jules, pointing at a black mass partially encased in the receding ice. "Probably where that smell is coming from," Martin thought out loud. And then they did what kids do. They went down to the dark mass and closer to the odor to investigate and possibly poke it with Jules's stick. Down near the creek bed and without the benefit of the breeze, the odor was nearly unbearable. Jules, through her hand cupped over her nose and mouth, said, "It looks like a person." "It does kind of look like a person," Danny agreed. "But how could a person be in the middle of this big hunk of ice?" Martin suddenly lit up with delight. "Maybe it's a caveman or something. Maybe we're going to be famous. Jules, you got your camera with you?" Proud of herself for being prepared to contribute to their fame, she beamed, "Sure do," and produced the silver digital camera from her backpack. Danny asked, "How long do you think it's been in there?" Trying to sound authoritative and intelligent, Martin posited, "He's probably been in there since the last ice age, probably thousands of years." "Thousands of years," Jules echoed. Danny walked up and looked a little closer at the exposed upper torso, upper arms from the shoulders down to just above the elbows, and head. He had no hair and didn't appear to have any clothes. His skin was as gray as a stormy sky, with blue veins that crackled across his arms like lightning. On the left side of his neck was a terrible tear in the gray flesh that exposed the black tissue underneath. "Looks like he's really starting to rot. Maybe something took a bite out of him, too." By this time, Jules had started taking pictures. Danny, getting his nerve up a little, stood right next to the find and smiled for a snap. With the blue-white flash of the camera still spreading itself out over and around the glacier like an echo, Danny was forced to duck out of harm's way as Martin swung Jules's stick at him. The blow went wide and landed on the ice just to the left of their caveman. "Careful, Marty," Jules warned. "You might hurt him or something. Maybe we should go get Mom and Dad." "Okay, but if Alec is there, we don't tell him. Deal?" The other two agreed enthusiastically. Martin, as a last measure of his feat, decided that he too should be photographed next to their find. if only for posterity's sake. He walked over and stood right next to the frozen figure and smiled. It was a big, cheesy smile that stretched all the way from their home in the Midwest to there in Alaska. Jules held the camera up and thought she saw something that was just out of the digital frame. She lowered the camera and looked more closely. Nothing. Lifting the camera back up, she snapped another picture. But this time, as the flash momentarily, partially blinded everyone, something did move. At first, Martin thought that it was just Danny swinging the same stick at him, but when the teeth came down on his shoulder, he knew better. The bite didn't break through his two shirts, but when Martin recoiled and raised his hand to fend off the attack, he squealed out in pain. The frozen man was lunging desperately, hungrily at Martin, and when he got hold of Martin's hand, he bit down hard, driving one of his few jagged brown teeth into Martin's soft white skin. His movements became more frantic, as he obviously tried to free himself and keep a tight hold of Martin's hand. Danny came to the rescue, striking at the man's head until he forced it to loosen its grip. Seemingly enraged, Martin's attacker started to literally quake in the icy grip that still held it firmly, if temporarily, in place. Martin fell onto his back on the gray, silty beach, clutching at his hand and crying pitifully, blood spilling onto his other hand and down his front, individual spots of crimson gradually forming into a single dark patch that covered his gray Alaska t-shirt. Danny, still holding the stick at the ready, said over his shoulder, "Jules, get him to his feet and let's get going. Jules, now!" Shaken from her stupor, Jules gathered Martin up to his feet and helped him up onto the ledge overlooking the creek. Danny was quickly on their heels, stick still in hand. Martin trailed blood and tears all the way back to the cabin. Even before they had gotten there, Danny started yelling at the top of his voice. He shouted for help, any help that he could get for his friend who was starting to stagger slightly. Mr. Hauser was the first to get to them, running to meet their voices just outside the clearing where the cabin sat. Martin's mother was standing in the doorway, looking out with concern. In her hand, she still held the knife with which she was cutting the watermelon she was preparing for a snack. She yelled from the door, "What happened, Marty?" He stuttered. "Bit me. He bit me. I can't believe it. He bit me." Mr. Hauser looked to Danny for clarification. "What's he talking about? Who bit Marty?" Jules chimed in. "It's true. There was a man, a caveman frozen in the ice, and he bit Marty's hand. He must have only been sleeping when he got frozen and woke up kind of hungry. He bit Marty awfully hard." Ginny, still in the doorway, shouted, "What happened, dear?" Mr. Hauser answered flatly, "Something bit Marty." "A man, a caveman bit Marty," Jules corrected, and running across the clearing toward her mother, she continued, "He smelled really bad, Mommy, and was yucky all over." She started to cry. "And when he bit Marty, he scared me." "Oh, honey, it'll be okay. Whatever it was is probably long gone by now. You're okay, and we'll make sure Marty is okay, too." Jules all but disappeared in the warm, sweet embrace of her mother, but the security therein did not stop the tears. By then, Mr. Hauser and Danny had helped Martin to the cabin. The puncture wound was a small hole in the soft tissue between Martin's thumb and index finger. To Mr. Hauser, it really didn't appear to be much of an injury, but try as he might to apply pressure, he couldn't stop the bleeding. He wiped the gash repeatedly, but as quickly as he did, like oil seeping up through sand, the blood returned. He'd soiled a handful of towels before deciding that something else needed to be done. "Marty's bleeding pretty bad here. I think we ought to get him to a hospital. He might need a rabies shot or something. Where's Alec?" "He's around the other side shooting baskets." "No, I'm not. I'm right here." "Heard him crying all the way up," interrupted Alec. He looked at Marty at first with annoyance, and then with genuine concern once he saw the amount and deep red of the blood that was all over his brother's shirt, pants, and arms. "What happened to you?" Danny relayed to Alec all that had happened, fully expecting some snide comment that would undoubtedly be tied to their age and the fact that they played soccer and were too short to play basketball. He didn't get any of that, though. In fact, Alec merely nodded his head and started to think about what could be done. He remembered the Remington 410 shotgun that was inside on top of the tall bookshelf. Maybe while everyone else was taking Marty to the hospital, he could go out toward the glacier and maybe get a little revenge. Yeah, that's what he'd do. He'd go out there and take care of whatever was out there. How hard could it be? Chapter 2. The trip down to the cabin had taken between 3 and 3.5 hours. They had driven at a leisurely pace, pointing out wildlife, mountains, and anything else that caught their eyes. Danny had been excited by everything. The water to his right, the Cook Inlet, he had heard it called, was so dark and cold and calm. It wasn't anything like any of the lakes or ponds back in Minnesota. They saw white goats on the tops of the steep cliffs that bordered the twisting Seward Highway. Danny couldn't imagine how they had gotten up there in the first place. A little further down, an eternity's worth of melting running water had cut a small grotto into the rocks at the road level. In this depression was a family of 3 goats. The mother and 2 babies were only a few feet from the lanes of the highway and its rushing cars. Of course, the Hausers and Danny had stopped and taken innumerable pictures. The goats didn't seem to mind, really. They just went about eating the green vegetation that was growing on and amidst the rocks. That had all taken place during the early morning hours of the day, when Alaska and its majesty was just emerging and finally wiping the last of the sleep from its eyes. The differences between the sun rising and the sun setting is truly amazing. What Danny was coming to realize was that sunset in Alaska was very different than anything he had ever experienced. The sun was as reluctant to go to bed as his kid sister back in Minnesota, who lingered and stalled all through the house despite being told that it was bedtime. When the sun did finally find its resting place behind the mountains to his left, there was a lingering purple hue that teased the eyes with hints of darkness without actually embracing shadows in earnest. It was dark without any real commitment. The radio was playing some forgotten song from some guy whose name, something Diamond, as he recalled, was lost on him. On the way to the cabin earlier in the day, Mr. Hauser would, on occasion for specific songs, turn up the volume until Ginny would look over at him, and then the volume would go back down. Now the music was barely audible and all but ignored by everyone in the van. Like a lost memory that no one missed enough to actually remember. Like the sun, it seemed that all the animals they had seen on the trip down had found their beds for the night. There were a few birds circling and fluttering over the inlet to his left, but even they seemed to be heading for their roosts, having punched out from working an avian third shift. He watched the last bird, a white and gray gull, circle and spin out of sight. It was then that he noticed that the inlet, earlier in the day surging and filled with white-capped dark water, was now an expanse of black sand or possibly mud. He wasn't sure of its consistency, but he was certain that it looked cold and forbidding, with tiny, desperate rivulets cut into its surface by separated pools of water seeking company. Danny sat back in his seat and closed his eyes. It had been a long, tiring day. As the first gentle caress of sleep greeted him, the image of the caveman, with his straggly long hair and bone-thin gray body, splashed itself violently into the calm pool of his mind. He jolted himself forward and threw open his eyes, half fearing what he'd see. Coming in quick, shallow gasps, His breathing surprised even him. He looked around, and nothing had changed except Jules. She was staring at him as if she had expected his abrupt waking.
"You saw him, didn't you?"
His brow wrinkled, and he searched for a response, but his tongue was too dry to form speech. For lack of words and through his still sharp breathing, Danny only nodded. He looked around for a distraction, anything. There was nothing. There was only Martin's delirium and drifts between stupor and semi-consciousness. His face was rapidly fading of any color, leaving a translucent layer of skin that didn't quite hide the pulsing blue veins just below the surface. The only color remaining in his face were two dark gray crescents forming under his swollen eyes. His pallid face glistened with sweat, though his temperature never rose above normal. Ginny, sitting in the front seat of the rented Chevy Venture minivan, kept leaning back to the first bench seat where Martin was languishing. She was crying and, quite obviously, terrified. It was killing her to see her little boy suffering so much and to not be able to do anything to alleviate the pain or make him better. She wrung her hands incessantly, not knowing for sure what to do or even what she could do. Mr. Hauser didn't speak much, choosing instead to focus on the road in front of him. He darted in and out of cars, sometimes skirting the right-hand shoulder to get around the lumbering motorhomes that dominated and were usually the cause of the long rows of traffic that choked the winding Seward Highway. Despite the traffic and the dark, Mr. Hauser was doing his best to cut the drive time in any way he was able. He was desperate, as much for Ginny as for little Martin, to get his son to the hospital in Anchorage. Jules and Danny were sitting in the bench seat furthest back in the van. Jules was crying quietly as she watched first her stricken brother, then her weeping mother, and then her intensely concentrating father. No one in their family had ever been this sick before, and it scared her terribly. She leaned into Danny on more than one occasion for some comfort. She had always liked Danny, especially since he readily agreed to let her come along with Marty and him. In fact, she was pretty sure that it was Danny who convinced her brother to let her come along at all. She didn't know that for sure, but she did know that before Danny came along, she had always been too young to play with Marty or tag along on any of his adventures with his other friends. Danny accepted her along, and as a result, so had Marty. Now, though, she wondered if it wouldn't just have been better had she not been along in the first place. If she weren't there with her camera, then maybe Marty wouldn't have gotten so close to the caveman and wouldn't have been bitten in the first place. Maybe it was all her fault that this was happening. She started to cry more loudly and said, "Mama, I'm sorry. It's all my fault that Marty is sick. It's all my fault." Her tears and sobbing mixed with her words in a confusing mess that was nearly unintelligible. Getting a concerned look from Ginny, Danny wrapped his arm around Jules and hugged her to him tightly. She kept crying into his shoulder, and all that Danny could understand was the word, "Camera." Chapter 3. They got to the hospital, Providence Medical Center, and Mr. Hauser scooped Martin from the back seat and carried him directly into the emergency room. It was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. It was very late Sunday evening by the time they arrived, and apparently injuries and sicknesses for everyone else in Anchorage had gone to bed early that night. There was a couple with an obviously sick infant. The mother was rocking gently back and forth, humming a tune that Danny recognized but couldn't identify. There was another woman there with her son who had a fishhook stuck all the way through his thumb. The boy was crying, but it appeared that his pain was gradually losing ground to his fatigue as his eyes opened more slowly with each blink. There was a man with his foot propped up on a pile of towels stacked atop the back of one of the black synthetic leather chairs. He was reading a magazine and didn't seem to be in any undue distress. There were nurses wearing scrubs and doctors and lab technicians with all too familiar white lab coats walking here and there. There was activity, but nowhere near the level that Danny had associated with a typical emergency room. His one trip to the hospital back home was over a very busy 4th of July weekend last summer. That was utter chaos, but nothing like the Providence emergency room. Danny and Jules sat in the chairs while Ginny and Mr. Hauser stood at the nurse's station, explaining that Martin had been bitten by some wild animal and needed to be seen immediately. Seeing the wad of blood-soaked towels and rags wrapped around the youngster's hand, the nurse behind the counter scribbled notes down on a piece of paper and hurried them through a pair of doors, behind which they disappeared for several minutes before Ginny reappeared to beckon Danny to bring Jules and follow her. Most children do not feel comfortable in hospitals, and Danny was no exception. The antiseptic smells, the oppressive white on the walls, beds, clothes, and even floor, and the presence of sickness all mixed to make a hospital as inhospitable a place as Danny could imagine. The three of them boarded an elevator that boasted a large letter E next to it, and took it to another floor, and then made their way through a series of hallways until they came to another nurse's station. They were in the intensive care unit, where Martin was receiving emergency and very aggressive treatment by specialists who hadn't yet been able to determine what was afflicting him. Danny heard a couple of nurses talking to one another about Martin. They couldn't seem to figure out why he was so sick from such a small bite. At least, that was what Danny understood them to be saying. He wasn't able to follow all of their words, but he could certainly read their demeanor. Standing there more or less next to and sometimes in the nurse's station, he was starting to feel very uncomfortable. Danny and Jules were shown to another set of black chairs and told to wait, and then Ginny scurried off down the hall and disappeared again. By that time, even the legendary midnight sun of Alaska had waned and night was fast upon the city. Jules was very quickly asleep, snoring small, kazoo-like sounds from her nose. Danny stood up and stretched and realized that he was about as alone as he could get. His only company was a sleeping 8-year-old girl and his thoughts. He, too, was exhausted, but was afraid to sleep. It was just something about hospitals. Chapter 4. Down the hall, and in one of the many rooms set aside for those patients requiring special care and attention, Ginny and Mr. Hauser were talking to a doctor. What kind of an animal was it? Mr. Hauser, starting to get frustrated with answering the same question over and over again, said through an aggravated sigh, "I don't know. For the 1,000th time, I don't know. Marty, his sister, and his friend all wandered down to the glacier while we got ourselves situated in the cabin. While they were there, something attacked my son." "Are the other 2 children here in the hospital? Maybe I could get an idea of any potential toxicity from them." "Yeah, they're down the hall. Ginny, you stay here while I take the doc to talk to Danny and Jules." Mr. Hauser's expression suddenly soured as he asked, "Oh, Jesus, what about Alec?" "Alec?" the physician repeated. Attempting futilely to bury his hands in his short, thinning hair, Mr. Hauser said softly, his eyes glancing over at his poor, tortured wife. "Our older son. He's still down at the cabin, all alone." He looked beyond his wife this time, trying to see past the scores of miles that separated him from his oldest boy. Alec was smart, but he was a teenager. Mr. Hauser was fully aware of the decision-making capabilities of a teenage brain succumbing to the potent mix of raging hormones and newly emerging ego. Mr. Hauser's worry for his son was evident to the doctor, who sympathized with the man's concern. He said hopefully, "Does Alec have a cell phone?" The worried father nodded but said dejectedly, "Yes, but they don't work up here, we discovered." Ginny, rising from her plastic chair with surprising agility, pleaded, "Please." But her words were smothered by her sorrow that stole away her voice and her breath all at once. She fanned her face with her thick, soft hand and tried to no avail to fight back her tears, which streaked down her fiery red cheeks. Mr. Hauser, as small as he may have been compared to his wife, wrapped her tightly in his arms and kissed her gently on the forehead. He held her against him for a time without saying a word. Then he said, "You take care of our boy and I'll be right back. Everything's going to be fine. Okay?" Ginny nodded through her tears and sat back down in the chair next to the bed. Martin was breathing in quick, shallow breaths. He hadn't opened his eyes in quite some time and hadn't said a word for an even longer time. The top of the sheet nearest to his face and neck was damp with sweat, as was his hair. The half-moons under his eyes had grown darker, giving the impression that his eyes were sinking deeper into their sockets. And then Martin Hauser was struggling to take in a breath. He started to shake horribly. Ginny grabbed his hand and started pleading. "Breathe, Marty, breathe. Listen to your mama. Breathe, honey, please." Unable to take her eyes away from the single bar of light that crawled across the life-monitoring machinery, she shouted to the closed door, "Oh, God, somebody come help me. Help my boy. Please, God, no. Somebody help me." She held her son's limp hand and refused to let it go. A nurse ran into the room and immediately checked Martin, checked the machines to which he was attached, and then checked Martin again. "Mrs. Hauser, I'm going to need you to step outside for a moment, please." Sounding almost sick, Ginny countered, "I'm staying with my boy. He needs me. My boy needs his mama. Marty, Mama's here, honey. Please wake up, honey, please. Oh, God, please." Another person and then another came in, but Ginny didn't even really notice anymore. They tried everything they could to revive little Martin, but try as they might, nothing they did seemed to work. He was absolutely unresponsive to any and all life-saving procedures they attempted. His little body was just too ravaged by whatever it was that was attacking it. Luckily, it wasn't a long battle. His body merely quit, and nothing seemed to matter. Ginny, still holding Martin's rapidly cooling hand, fell onto the floor and sat there, weeping. The terrible, dull, cold pain that filled her chest and fouled her stomach was like nothing she had ever known, and something that she could have gone her entire life without knowing. The day and all that had happened seemed but a blur of images, and then only agony. Had it only been one day? She wasn't remotely certain anymore. The one thing that she was sure of, though, was that her little boy was gone. Forever. One of the nurses, the first to have arrived in the room, leaned closer to Ginny and whispered, "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Hauser." It was then that the grief finally grabbed hold of her. Her weeping became loud, sobbing. Attempts to lift her from the floor were swiped away with her moist, meaty hands. "Just leave me alone. Leave me be. Let me have a few minutes with my little boy. I only want a few more minutes with my boy." Realizing that it would be just as well to let her calm down in the room rather than out in the hallway and risk disturbing other patients, the collection of white and blue-clad medical staff all decided to leave her where she sat. Once alone, Ginny hoisted herself up and into one of the chairs in the room. She sat there quietly for several minutes while she tried to digest what had just happened. Could her little Martin be gone? Her face was hot with sorrow and tears, and her head pounded painfully. She sat there, staring blankly at the wall. When the sheet covering her now motionless Martin moved, she was startled and a little excited. Had they made a mistake? She stood up and got closer to the bed as he sat up. "Marty, are you okay, honey?" Standing next to his bed, Ginny leaned in and took the child in her arms. She held him tight against her, resting his head on her shoulder. She couldn't have been happier. Her boy was all right. She neither saw him open his eyes, nor did she see the burning hunger that colored his blackened irises. She felt him move, but didn't see his mouth open wide just before he dug his teeth into her throat. In terror, she tried to scream but was unable to as his jaw crushed her windpipe while he ripped huge chunks of soft white tissue from her neck. She fell backward with a look of profound astonishment across her face. Marty leapt from the bed and followed her down to the floor. Chapter 5. Mr. Hauser and Dr. Caldwell had, meanwhile, been talking to Danny about the attack and the animal that bit young Martin. Neither of the men accepted that it was a caveman of sorts that had been responsible. They asked Danny again and again, in every way they could imagine, to describe to them what had happened and what had done it. Nearly to tears, Danny couldn't seem to impress upon them how serious he was, nor how sure he was of whom or what had bitten poor Martin. It was Jules who came to the rescue with,
"Danny's right. He's telling the truth. He's on my camera."
Mr. Hauser asked, "What?"
"Go ahead, look."
"What's on there, honey?"
"He is, I think. He was too scary to look at, so I just turned my camera off. But he's still on there. Go ahead, look."
Mr. Hauser grabbed the camera abruptly from his daughter. He pressed the power button, and the idling camera turned off and beeped. Dead battery. "Jules, honey, did you actually turn the camera off?"
I thought I did."
"God damn it. Do you have the power cord?"
"Uh-huh,"
she said, and produced the black cord from her bag. The doctor grabbed the first hospital staffer he saw, a young certified nursing assistant named Jerry. He didn't know Jerry that well, but he did know that Jerry was young, likely electronically inclined, and could more than likely make this camera work again. "Take this camera and the three of them to the nearest outlet and make this thing work. As soon as you get it going, come find me. Drop everything else that you're doing and get this done now. Got it?" The doctor didn't bother to wait for a response. He turned and was about to speak with Mr. Hauser again when a scream from down the hall drew both of their attentions. It was coming from the direction of Martin's room. The two of them ran down the hall, Mr. Hauser shouting to Danny, "Take care of Jules!" Danny nodded, though Mr. Hauser was no longer facing him and followed the new guy that was taking them to an office only 2 doors from where they were. Jerry fumbled with a keychain that, in Danny's estimation, probably held keys for every door in the hospital, as well as Jerry's house, his car, and the doors of all of his neighbors. They rattled and jingled a song while he sought the proper key. He finally got the door open, and on the other side of the door was a small office cluttered with file boxes in one corner, a computer monitor and CPU on and under the corner of a desk of sorts, and a pair of chairs that just barely fit into the small space. Jerry moved a picture frame of several someones, none of which were Jerry, and exposed a black power outlet that amazingly wasn't being used. They all sat down, Jerry in the bigger, more plush office chair, and Danny and Jules sharing the other chair. They watched the little light on the side of the camera go from red to green in a matter of seconds. Jerry, a 19-year-old who had just earned his GED and nursing assistant certification a few months ago, had been working for Providence Health Systems for about 6 months, but had just moved to the hospital from one of its long-term care annexes from around the city. He was glad to have made the change. He liked what he did, even the nitty-gritty of helping elderly folks dress, bathe, and care for themselves. He found it difficult, however, to work in a setting in which he constantly saw those for whom he had cared and grown accustomed to seeing die. He realized that was the nature of such a facility, but it was still hard for him to get close with some of these folks, only to arrive some mornings to find that Mrs. Gillum died last night, or that Mr. Fredrickson had elected to go home to spend his last hours with family. He wasn't prepared to be reminded of his mortality in such aggressive ways so early on in his medical career. He wanted to work somewhere that he might be able to save lives, and not just to watch people die. It had become very depressing, and he was all set to go back to work as a cashier at Fred Meyer when he was presented with the opportunity to move over to the hospital and work as a floater, moving between departments. He knew that helping doctors directly and getting them to know your name was one way that he might meet the right person who could help steer him toward the best opportunity to advance his career. He wanted to get a degree in the health industry, but was unsure of whether he wanted to complete a degree in nursing or to get a series of certifications that would allow him to really diversify his worth to any hospital or medical group. He knew that he wanted to be in the medical field, he just wasn't sure in what capacity that might be. Before he started his vocational training classes, he never would have thought it possible that he would be thinking in such long-term possibilities, and now that was all that he could do. He finally could feel his future opening up to him, and for once he was excited about something beyond next weekend. Jerry lifted the camera, saying, "Do you mind if I have a look?" Jules, partly surprised to have an adult ask her permission to do anything, nodded. "Go ahead." "Okay, how do you... never mind. Got it." Jerry pressed 2 buttons and was then advancing rapidly through a day's worth of tourist photos. Barely pausing to even see the pictures as they passed, he asked, "What are we supposed to be looking for? What did the doc want us to find?" The next image was his answer. What he saw in that picture was frightening. "Is this real?" Both kids nodded to him. "Where was this?" Jules, lifting her shoulders, said innocently, "Far away, in Alaska." Danny added, "I think I heard something about a place called Seward somewhere close by, but I don't know for sure. This is my first time up here." Almost as an afterthought, Jerry said absently, "Welcome to Alaska. First time, huh?" "Yeah." Jerry couldn't change the camera's digital facade. The face contained therein was horrifying and a little familiar. He had seen faces like this one before, but never in his wildest dreams did he think he would see them thus. The face was hideously disfigured and gray, with skin stretched tightly across his cheekbones and jaw. In some places, those same bones were emerging from breaks and tears in the upper layer of tissue. There were no eyes in the empty and blackened sockets, but the face did seem to be looking, searching. His gums were the same color and seeming consistency as tar, and were spread out over his few brown, jagged teeth. This wasn't a caveman, as the kids had suggested, but he couldn't get his mind around what it appeared to be. Things like this existed only in horror movies or video games. He knew that for him to tell someone, anyone, about his suspicions, he would first be laughed at, and then sent to the lab to have a urinalysis drug screen performed. How could he possibly approach someone, especially someone of authority, and tell them that he thinks they have a zombie problem? The screaming down the hall had intensified to an almost feverish pitch. Jerry could tell that the level of activity and, in all probability, chaos had also increased. There had been several calls for security personnel over the public address system. To the chorus of screaming had been added an accompanying rhythm of smashing furniture and a melody of shattering glass. Instinctively, Jerry knew that he needed to get out of there. He looked at the 2 kids in his charge and paused. What was he to do with them? He could just say that he had to get out of there and leave them to their own luck. He could venture down that hallway and try and find their dad, or at least the doctor with whom the dad seemed to be working. Or... He looked at the little boy. "What's your name?" "Danny." "Where are you from, Danny?" "Minnesota." "And how about you?" he asked, looking at the cute little girl. "I'm Julie. Jules. And I'm from Minnesota, too." "You guys brother and sister?" Danny answered. "No, I'm up here with her family on vacation before the school year starts. It was her brother who got bit and got sick." "If it's okay with you two, we're going to go find someplace safe to wait until all the shouting has stopped, okay?" The shouting and screaming was moving closer down the hall. Then they heard what could only be described as a gunshot that reverberated down toward them. For a second or two, the loud resonance banging around inside their heads was all that any of them could hear. Jerry looked one more time down the hall to try and discern if either the doctor or the dad was coming back. Scared faces hurried from the hallway, some pushing people in wheelchairs and some pushing beds and gurneys with sheet-draped patients still on them. He said to the kids and to himself, "This is going to get really bad really quick. I think we better get out of here. I promise I won't let anything happen to either of you, and as soon as they get all of this sorted out, we'll come back here and find your mom and dad and brother. How does that sound?" Jules was hesitant at first until another gunshot got her back to her feet. She was ready, and with that, so was Danny. Chapter 6. While Jerry, Danny, and Jules were attempting to get the camera to work and Jerry was coming to the realization of what was happening, something very different was occurring down in Martin's room. The initial scream that had spurred the doctor and Mr. Hauser down the hall came from a nurse who had gone back into Martin's room to check on the grieving Ginny. She was not at all prepared for what she saw. Ginny was lying on her back, motionless, her head in a pool of thick, sticky, and steadily spreading very red blood. Hunched over her was the boy that only minutes before had been declared dead. The nurse heard a horrible, wet, tearing sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of chewing. When the little boy finally sensed the nurse's presence, he turned quickly, his face covered in the soft, mortal remains of his own mother, and lunged at her. She pushed him away desperately, screaming for help all the while. He bit her on the wrist, and with surprising ease opened her radial artery and vein. The pain immediately helped her get her wits about her. She positioned her legs as she had been instructed in self-defense class, one behind the other. Then she struck her attacker with the palm of her hand, hitting him on the chest in a very powerful downward thrust. He was pushed backward and tumbled awkwardly head over heel for a moment. That was enough for her to get out and shut the door behind her. Still leaning against the door, being nudged again and again from the other side, she applied all the pressure she could to her wrist. She slowed the bleeding somewhat, but the loss of blood was starting to make her feel weak. She was only partially coherent when all the others arrived. The doctors, the environmental techs, the other nurses. So many faces. Her consciousness was almost completely faded when Dr. Kozlov opened the door and released the maniacal child into the hallway. The battle, the pushing, the biting, the hitting, the beating, less than a blur, really. Cold. There was only cold now.
"Jesus Christ! What the hell was wrong with that kid?" demanded Jackson Linus. "Man, I didn't know being a fucking security guard at the hospital meant that I was gonna be getting bit."
Dr. Milanus shook his head and answered honestly. "I don't know. We pronounced him dead. He was dead. We tried to resuscitate, but got nothing." Linus tucked his chin closer to his neck, wrinkled his brow incredulously, and said,
"You what? You mean he was... But he was up and... What are you trying to say? Could you've made a mistake somehow? Maybe he wasn't dead and just woke up real pissed off that you wrote him off so easy."
"No, he was dead."
"Then how do you explain this?" asked Linus, showing the doctor his wound. "He sure bites awfully hard for a dead kid."
The sight of the security guard's wound was enough to bring the doctor back. He tried to bring order to the hallway. He needed to know who all was hurt, and then start to prioritize based upon severity of injury. He was reminded of his days as a field surgeon with the Army in Kuwait. There, he had to triage dozens of men with horrible shrapnel and bullet wounds, and had to do it sometimes with the sound of artillery resounding overhead. Mr. Hauser and Dr. Caldwell returned somewhere in the midst of the chaotic aftermath. When Dr. Milanus saw Mr. Hauser, he realized the poor father hadn't even heard that his son had died the first time yet. The doctor was all set to deliver the terrible news and then the bizarre events following the boy's death when Mr. Hauser recognized the dead child on the floor in the middle of the hallway. His face, chest, and legs filled with bewildering shock. He was utterly speechless. His eyes speaking volumes, asking questions, pleading for understanding. There were at least 3 white-clad hospital employees on the floor holding gauze to wounds on their legs, arms, and one's face. Then there was the large black security guard standing with Dr. Milanus. His hand was bleeding, but in the other he was holding a large, heavy black flashlight that was quite obviously shimmering with wetness. Mr. Hauser quickly surmised that it was this man who had beaten his child to death. He fell to his knees at his child's side, scooped the boy up in his arms, and then rolled him over onto his back. Mr. Hauser recoiled in terror at the sight of his boy. The gray under his eyes had spread to most of his face, while all of his veins, blue with oxygen-depleted blood, stood out like blue webbing just beneath his skin. The most startling thing, though, was the blood and other matter that was spread across his face, especially his mouth. He was an utter mess and barely resembled the boy who had been so excited to be in Alaska just a handful of hours ago. Mr. Hauser's weeping slackened just slightly and became concerned when he realized that he didn't see his wife anywhere amongst the faces standing around him. He looked at Dr. Milanus and demanded, "Where's Jenny? Where's my wife? What have you done with her?" He shot angry looks first at Dr. Milanus and then at the security guard who was hiding the flashlight-turned weapon behind his leg. Dr. Milanus had forgotten about the grieving mother who, to his mind, was probably still behind the closed door of the boy's former room. He looked at the door and paused. There was a smear of red, more than likely from the nurse who had been attacked and then held the door closed until Dr. Kozlov opened it. Mr. Hauser was able to surmise the doctor's thoughts and went to the door. He looked back at his dead son, still lying alone in the middle of the floor, mentally trying to come up with a way to explain to his wife just what had happened. He opened the door and saw a pool of blood on the floor and footsteps leading away from it. They were smaller footsteps, so Mr. Hauser assumed those must be from Martin. At first, he didn't see Ginny. It appeared that she had already fled the room. Maybe she was down the hall being treated herself. Whose blood was that on the floor? Something, a kind of wet, tearing sound, drew his attention over toward the bathroom door in the corner. The door was propped open slightly, and there on the floor, on her knees, partially in the doorway, was Ginny. It was then that he saw there was someone else there on the floor, with her, under her. She was straddling a pair of legs wearing white slacks and white shoes. Ginny was grunting and breathing very deeply. "Jenny, honey, is everything okay?" He didn't even have time to register surprise before she was upon him. They crashed against the wall with a thud that shook everyone still in the hallway outside. Doctors Milanus and Caldwell realized something was very wrong, but it was too late. The first nurse that Martin had attacked and bitten on the hand shot up from the gurney on which she was laying and took hold of the orderly standing near her. Dr. Kozlov, who had been suffering horribly from the bite wound to his face, lost his balance at the same time and collapsed on the floor, convulsing as he lay dying. He was up again before anyone was able to pry loose the orderly from the nurse's gnashing teeth. He leapt at Dr. Milanus, biting the back of the physician's neck right at the base of his skull. The doctor tried to fend off his attacker, but the teeth were sunk in too deeply and the arms were holding too tightly. He spun around like a bronco trying to buck its rider, but the teeth only dug deeper. There was no one who could help him, as everyone around him was fighting his or her own separate battles. Orderlies and security guards were attempting to hold at bay the multiplying assailants, while at the same time ferrying away victims suffering from multiple wounds. Several of the guards themselves were bitten. Jackson Linus, bitten 3 times in quick succession, first by the initial nurse victim and then by the deranged Dr. Kozlov, fought tooth and nail, swinging his flashlight like a club, until he too fell due to loss of blood. 2 Anchorage police officers arrived just moments into the scuffle, and already the situation was beginning to look grim. To the officers, the chaotic melee dancing and swelling like a storm cloud in the middle of the hall appeared to be perhaps a group of deranged patients and even some staff attacking another group of patients and staff that was trying desperately to get away. From the other side of the melee, the officers could hear screams emerging from patient rooms that had been cut off by the battle. The tiled floor and once sterile walls were spattered with blood. The air was thick with the warm, salty smell of the fluid. Sergeant Gibson pulled his sleek semi-automatic pistol from his hip holster. With no clear targets and not sure what to do, he held the firearm aloft and fired into the ceiling, hoping to end or at least stall the fighting. It flew in the face of his training, but under the chaotic circumstances it seemed his most likely option. He hoped that the suddenness of his action, the sheer audacity of it, would force everyone to stall and things could get sorted. Instead, the shot had the same effect as a starter's pistol at a race. Everyone, absolutely everyone still able to run began to sprint right at the 2 police officers. Sergeant Gibson and his rookie partner were hardly able to discern friend from foe. They both began discharging their weapons at the most threatening people and faces, but their bullets didn't seem to have any effect. On more than one occasion, the 9mm slugs passed through the softer tissue of upper chests or lower abdomens, blood and sinew spraying behind, and yet the charging body scarcely showed any slackening in pace. After each had emptied his pistol to no effect, the 2 officers were simply absorbed in the wave of carnage that swept over them. And the wave, like the unstoppable and inevitable tides, spilled out of the emergency ward and into the rest of the hospital and street outside. Chapter 7. Neil Spencer was content with his job, but definitely not happy. He worked with a mortgage originating company in Anchorage and, as such, felt like he was in a position to help ordinary people realize their dreams. He was able, by getting his portion of the preliminary approval documents completed in a timely fashion, to make the oftentimes intimidating process of becoming a first-time homebuyer a little less traumatic for his clients. He also taught classes to help people understand Alaska Housing Finance Corporation's rules and procedures. Again, just trying to do more than his part. He wanted to have a job in which he wasn't merely making rich people richer, and that was how it felt throughout his first 7 years. He had no illusions about that now, though. His ideas of making grand, sweeping political and social improvements had long since faded. There was a saying, "You can be an idealist and Democrat in your 20s, but you're a fool if you weren't a capitalist and Republican by the time you were in your 30s. He wasn't to the point of being Republican yet, but he had certainly scaled down his visions for social change. He could, however, help one family at a time and make a difference in their lives. It was for that reason that he came into work early every day. Maybe he hadn't missed his chance. He found that his idealism was most prevalent early in the day, when everything still seemed possible. And there he sat, in his office, well, his cubicle. He was thankful that it was his own cubicle and he didn't have to share his rat cage with someone else like so many of his colleagues. Small blessings could mean so much. It was just after 7 in the morning, and Neil got up from his workstation to make his way to the window on the other side of the large office. The morning rituals. His morning rituals were important to him, and perhaps slightly humorous to the casual observer. He didn't drink much coffee, but having that first mug from the first pot of the day was spectacular to him. Getting to look at the whole newspaper before it had been ravaged and separated and lost was such a treat as to motivate him to be at the office well before everyone else. And of course there was the most important moment in his morning ritual. She would get there soon. He wasn't sure of her name, though he thought he had heard her called Lainey in the lobby out near the elevator. She, too, got to work early every day, hustled into the building, and then went upstairs to whichever company for which she worked. She dressed well, but not exceptionally, which led him to believe that she was perhaps an administrative assistant, accounting clerk, or human resource specialist, working some position that did most of the work and received the least of the salary and distinction. Regardless of how she dressed, he thought she was stunning. He knew what Neil Young meant when he wished for a cinnamon girl. Her skin was as inviting as a sweet roll, and he could only imagine how sweet she smelled. When she ran, her long curls bounced and rolled on her back and over her shoulders. She really was a thing of beauty. Despite his attraction to her, he was still a little skittish about approaching women since his divorce. He watched every day as she backed her aged Ford Explorer into the same parking spot, checked her makeup in her rear-view mirror with the colorful lays hanging from it, gathered her papers and folders from the previous night's work, and then got out. More than once, he found himself hurrying to the office door and pausing before going out into the lobby. He just couldn't bring himself to take that last but essential step. Besides, he reasoned, she was way out of his league anyway. She was beautiful and he was, well, he was him. Maybe today would be the day. Maybe he'd go out and actually strike up a conversation, introduce himself, open a door of opportunity perhaps. Maybe today he wouldn't go out into the lobby only to head directly to the men's room. She probably thought he had some kind of bladder condition, if she thought anything about him at all. He tried to shake off his doubts, sipping his coffee, flavored with a cinnamon creamer, in nearly complete silence. There was the buzz of the office computer server, the high-pitched white noise of the computers themselves, and the barely audible click of the analog wall clock hanging near the door. The quiet was nice, comforting, maybe. And so he waited for her. Chapter 8. Arriving at his office building earlier than usual, Kurt Tolliver sat and waited in the comfort of his car. He was just so happy with his most recent acquisition, a green Subaru Forester. He fidgeted with the overhead digital temperature display, clock, and compass. He was still finding new features on his car, a veritable treasure trove of gadgets and extras. The sound-dampening glass very nearly muted the approaching sirens of the emergency vehicles. He, like most people in Anchorage, was not necessarily indifferent to sirens like those unfortunate souls consigned to the life of a large American city. He was, however, distracted, and in the back of his mind he remembered that they were awfully close to the hospital. The occasional siren was not completely out of the ordinary. Perhaps the sheer numbers of sirens and the feeling that they were all converging exactly where he was should have warranted some concern, but again, he was distracted with his new car. He got out, started to step away, and then remembered his briefcase in his back seat. He pressed the button on his door remote and, opening the rear door on the driver's side, leaned into the back seat, reaching all the way across to the opposite side. The new car smell greeted him again like it was the first time its doors had ever been opened. Chapter 9. Neil, standing at the window and still waiting for the lovely Lainey, watched as what appeared to be a drunken man staggered across the parking lot in the direction of the parked Subaru. The unsteady figure trudged through two fairly sizable water puddles in his trek across the lot. His steps were like those of a toddler, but his direction was undeniable. He was on a collision course with the new green Subaru. To Neil, the man appeared to be wearing a uniform of sorts, a security guard, perhaps. He caught faint glints of reflection from what appeared to be a badge on his chest. He was certain that whatever company the man worked for would certainly be proud today. What a great representative for their services and their company. He was thinking to himself that he was glad he had recognized when it was time to stop drinking. He didn't envy the headache the drunk man was sure to have later today. Neil saw the curly-haired blonde guy get out of his car while the other guy got even closer. And then Neil realized that something wasn't right. He wasn't quite sure what exactly it was, but there was something exceptionally odd about the staggering man. He evinced quite a bit of agitation and maybe even aggression, Neil observed, and as he got nearer to the oblivious curly-haired blonde guy, his pace quickened and his arms rose. It appeared as if he was going to grab him. To do what, Neil wasn't entirely sure, but he was pretty sure that it wasn't going to be good. Chapter 10. Kurt Tolliver, having retrieved his leather portfolio from his back seat, stood away from his car. He looked at the steel and glass building in front of him, catching sight of a reflection of a pair of seagulls circling. Looking up and watching the birds' reflections whirl and swirl in updrafts of air, he breathed in deeply and tasted the moisture as it crawled into his lungs. Something didn't seem quite right to him, though it was just a hint of smell that tickled his nose and brought on a sneeze. As he doubled over with the force of the sneeze, he thought he heard something that sounded like someone was hitting the inside of a window on the building. When he had recovered from his expiation, he stood back up and saw the reflection of something else altogether in the mirrored glass in front of him. There was someone else with him. Right next to him, in fact. He turned and saw unbridled rage in the ravenous eyes of a man that didn't seem quite human. Kurt turned to run, but his attacker's hands found their mark, one grabbing his arm and the other finding purchase in his blonde curls. He screamed in fear, a sound that he had never heard come from himself before. Chapter 11. Neil dropped his coffee cup and started pounding on the glass of his first-floor office window. But it was all for naught and too late. Like a snagged fish, Kurt Tolliver was hooked and caught. Neil was frozen. It didn't seem that any of this could be real. How could it be? The staggering man pulled his victim to the pavement, clawing and biting and ravaging him brutally. He was acting like a wild animal, a predator who'd just brought down his kill. Neil tried in vain to move his legs, but he was planted as immobile as a granite statue. His breathing was shallow. The quiet had returned to the room, but this quiet was anything but peaceful. Unable to think of anything else to do, he spun around and found a phone. He punched 911 on the dial pad and then walked back to his post at the window, stretching the cord behind as he went. The blonde-haired guy, the victim, was no longer struggling. His attacker was still violently assailing him, but, like the still very much alive moth that is devoured by the spider, the poor man was only able to flex his hands feebly, painfully, with each vicious bite. Just seconds later, his hands were no longer moving. It was over. At least it should have been over, but the assailant was still biting at him and tearing away pieces of him. He was eating him. He bit at the now exposed stomach of the man and pulled off a large piece of dripping white flesh. He chewed hungrily and was moving in for another bite even before he'd finished the first. That was enough for Neil. The phone, he suddenly realized, had been playing a recorded message about all lines being busy and to try his callback later. The voice was very sorry for any inconvenience, but they were experiencing a high volume of calls right then, according to the repeated message. He just dropped the phone and ran to the storage room. Where the fuck is it? And then he had his hands on it. A long, white, locking security cable for laptop computers. Looking out the window to make sure the ghoul was still busy with his fresh kill, Neil ran out to the front doors of the office building to lock them with the cable. When he reached the door, he saw that another vehicle had pulled up out front, having come in from the rear entrance. A brown Chevy truck pulled into the parking lot and stopped a fair distance away from the green Subaru and the two men still on the pavement. The driver, a shortish blonde woman who Neil had seen in the building from time to time, got out and started across the lot. She was on her cell phone and completely unaware of the horror that was unfolding only yards away from her. Who could she possibly be talking to at this hour of the morning? Neil watched as she got closer and closer, finally drawing the attention of the attacker, who leapt to his feet and started running toward her. She realized immediately that he was coming after her, so she reeled about and ran back to her truck. She had a good lead and was able to get into the vehicle just seconds before her chaser reached her. Neil was about to wrap the wire around the door handles when he noticed that the blonde-haired guy was starting to move again. In fact, the man was able to get himself to his feet again. "Hey, are you okay? Hey!" Neil shouted, and was starting out the door until the man turned around and started running straight at him. As he ran, Neil watched his insides slowly spill out in red and pink folds of flesh onto the pavement and get left behind, some still attached and trailing behind him like some horrible preternatural tale. "Fuck this!" he shouted, and pulled the heavy glass front doors closed. He wrapped the cable tightly around the door handles and then fastened the lock. Almost at once, the curly-headed blonde guy was there clawing at the glass, leaving bloody streaks and smears. The sound he was making was anything but human. It sounded labored and primordial and hungry. Neil stood there only long enough to make sure that the woman in the truck wasn't in any immediate danger, but for some reason she hadn't started the truck and driven away. The answer lay in the middle of the lot, a pile of strung black and white beads and notched metal. She'd dropped her keys in her surprise and haste and was now trapped and under siege in the very tenuous safety of her vehicle. Neil backed away from the doors, hoping that they would hold long enough for him to figure out what to do and then do it. He went back into the office and tried the phone again, only to verify that the lines were all still busy. He sat down at his chair for just a moment to think. He wouldn't be able to get to his car because it was out front near the Subaru. He was cut off from it. He did, however, know where the keys were for the company vehicle, which was parked downstairs in a secure parking garage. He had to think fast. He had to stay in control. What would he need? He couldn't quite control his breathing as he fought to clear his thoughts. Absently, he went to the staff refrigerator and dumped the several unopened water bottles into the bottom of an empty copy paper box. The box was a lucky find. The new janitorial crew had once again, thankfully, forgotten to take all the trash when they serviced the office this weekend. He tossed into the box a partial loaf of bread and a plastic jar of peanut butter as well. He couldn't bring himself to take the leftovers in the styrofoam containers. They just remained off-limits in his mind. He grabbed the keys from the filing drawer at the front desk and even thought to grab the small set of tools on the shelf in the storeroom. The hammer he gripped in his hand and swung several times, intending to use it more as a tomahawk or hatchet as opposed to its original purpose. He was having a hard time balancing the box, now also laden with a fire extinguisher from the wall, while trying to also hold the hammer, so he elected to hook the hammer's head into a belt loop and let it hang loosely. He took 3 deep breaths, holding each, and tried to prepare himself to venture out. He looked at the clock as he set himself to depart, a habit he had developed over the years, coming and going at the office. It was just minutes after 7 in the morning. He peeked out and saw the mutilated, curly-haired blond man still clawing at the front doors. The security cable seemed to be holding tight, but he didn't see the point in pushing matters. He went down to the basement garage in the elevator. The garage door was still securely closed, and the only vehicles in the garage were the company minivan, a vintage Corvette draped in a white dust cover, and a maintenance truck. Neil ran as fast as his cumbersome load would allow and threw himself into the front seat of the minivan. Dropping the keys twice in his haste, he finally got the van started. With the doors securely locked, He sat and pondered his next move, concentrating as he did on slowing his breathing, knowing that if he wasn't careful, he might hyperventilate. Calming himself, he tried to focus on the task at hand. He didn't have anything with which to defend himself, and he was pretty certain that he would need something before too long. He could go to Fred Meyer's. They had food, water, and, perhaps most importantly for his peace of mind, firearms. He opened the garage and saw another car, a small sedan, scream by, nearly out of control. Even with the windows up, he could hear the wail of sirens coming from every direction. On the not-too-distant horizon, just in front of the sunrise, still in its daily infancy, a pillar of smoke was making its lazy way to the sky. The smoke appeared to be rising up from somewhere near the hospital. He needed to get to Fred's quickly, but he didn't want to drive like that sedan. He needed to be smart. He looked at his full gas gauge and felt better. Turning on the radio, though, wasn't any comfort at all. He heard the test pattern and the recording that, if this were an actual emergency, no news. He needed to get to the highway and head south, intending to get Fred Meyer's quickly before things got completely out of control. As he passed the front parking lot, he noticed that the woman in the truck still hadn't moved. Her attacker was still pounding away at the front of the truck and on the metal doors, but thankfully he hadn't been able to breach the windows yet. Neil then saw the woman, who sat up for a brief second. Even from this distance, the two of them caught one another's eyes. Neil stopped in the middle of the road, took a deep breath, gripped the steering wheel, and turned sharply into the parking lot, heading straight for the truck. The woman's assailant was on the passenger side of her truck, so that was where Neil aimed his van. His engine growled slightly as he fed it gas and urged it forward quicker and quicker. He hit the other man, sending him flying out of the parking lot and onto the grass that ran along the highway several feet away. Neil shot a look at the woman, who was crawling out of her passenger door. Neil flipped the switch to the lock, but she was already pulling on the handle. Nothing happened. She pulled and pulled again. Neil was unable to do anything. Every time he hit the switch, she was pulling. He finally reached across and flipped the lock open manually. Screaming, she hopped into the door just as the man was getting back up and over to them. Neil now saw that it was a uniform the other man was wearing. It was an apparently battle-worn security guard uniform, and the name patch just above his shiny badge read, Linus. "You okay?" Wild-eyed, she demanded, "Just drive! Get us the fuck out of here!" Neil swung the van around, dragging Linus through part of the parking lot until the deranged guard fell off, rolling violently away. Just seconds later, Neil and his new passenger were heading south on the Seward Highway, making their way toward the Midtown Fred Meyer, which was within sight of them even as they got on the main road. Neil, never taking his eyes off the road, said, "My name is Neil." Chuckling quietly to herself, the woman answered, "Rachel." "Why did you laugh?" She looked over at him and answered, "That's the name of the guy I was talking to on the phone back there." Neil answered with a nod and nothing more. The rest of the drive was highlighted only by the repeating cycle on the radio of the emergency broadcast system. It was just under 5 minutes before they were pulling into the nearly empty parking lot of the big box store. He pulled right up to the front doors and stopped. Rachel looked at him and asked, "What the hell are we stopping here for? Some early Christmas shopping?" "We need supplies." "You think this is going to be some kind of fucking camping trip? We need to go to the police. We need some protection." "Listen, I don't know if you could hear or not, but I think I heard every siren in the city heading toward the hospital. My guess is that there aren't any police left to help us. And until they can, we've got to help ourselves. There's something really weird and really wrong going on right now, and what I'd like to do is get out of its way." "What did you have in mind?" Chapter 12. Authorities in bunkered hospital offices tried desperately to determine what was happening and what could be done about it. They watched on surveillance cameras as groups of fleeing survivors moved from floor to floor and from department to department. There seemed to be no exits still available. There was also no time to talk or to plan, as each door or stairwell that was barricaded was systematically broken down and hordes of attackers poured through. As each new area was abandoned, fewer and fewer members of these groups continued. They were being exterminated little by little. In one fleeing group, Dr. Caldwell, who had attempted to treat little Martin Hauser much earlier that morning, was starting to understand that any bite, regardless of severity or treatment, was lethal. Even more troubling was that he was also beginning to understand that the bites also initiated a biological change in the victim that ultimately led to the reanimation of dead tissue. It was nearly impossible for him to accept. He was a man of science and healing, and this was the stuff of science fiction. The reanimated victims were only human in appearance, retaining no memory, no faculties aside from basic ambulation and senses, and no restraint or fear. What they did develop, however, was a seemingly insatiable hunger and a ruthless disregard for any sense of compassion. They became, in essence, cannibalistic homicidal machines. The horrific things he had seen today made his head swim and his stomach turn. Patients, restricted to their beds by injury or illness, were butchered where they lay. Recovery rooms had become hellish smorgasbords. He shuddered to think what had happened to those innocents in the nursery and in the NICU. Maybe the monsters hadn't made it that far yet. Maybe the security guards had been blocked and had held the mob at bay. He looked at what remained of their group. There were maybe 20 people with him. They were exhausted and terrified and not sure where they were going to go next. He wasn't sure on what floor they were, but knew that they couldn't keep going up indefinitely. Eventually, they'd come to the top floor and be trapped. If only they could know where to go or what to do, but even then, he could hear the moaning from the stairwell getting louder and closer. They were still being followed. He knew they had to keep moving, but before they did, he wanted to do a quick assessment of their group. There was one police officer with them, though his pistol had proven largely ineffective in even slowing the pursuers, let alone discouraging or stopping the pursuit. There were a couple of maintenance workers in long blue coveralls, some nurses, both male and female, and a collection of administrative personnel such as office clerks and secretaries. Perhaps most troubling, especially if his hypothesis about the effects of the bites was true, there were 3 members of the group who had been bitten, and one of them was starting to look more and more like that little boy from the emergency room. The Hauser boy. He took the police officer aside to express his fears. The officer nodded as he listened, but his face twisted in incredulity. He listened to everything the doctor had to say and then asked,
"So what are you saying, Doc? Should we leave them here or just shoot them now?"
There was a certain degree of skepticism in the officer's words, but enough seriousness to indicate that the officer was at least aware that these were very serious options that needed to be considered. Just then, the 2 of them heard a phone ringing in an open office to their right. It rang 3 times, then stopped. Then it rang another 3 times, and stopped. As it began to ring again, Dr. Caldwell picked it up and cautiously answered. "Hello? This is Dr. Caldwell." "Doctor," a voice began, "I need you to head to the top floor. Do everything you can to block any and all doors. We're going to get you out of there, but you have to put some space between you and them. Do you understand?" "Yes, but how do you—" "We've been keeping an eye on you with the security cameras. The trackers are about 2 floors down from you, but headed your way. We need you to get moving now. Get upstairs as fast as you can, but remember to block the stairs and any doors as well as you can. Do any of the maintenance men with you have their keys on them? Can they lock the doors?" "No. Their keys don't work in this tower, but we'll do our best." "Doctor, I don't want to hear that you'll do your best. We need you to take charge and get those people out of there. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Okay. If you get 2 other phones and need help, call me back at extension 1138. "Thanks. But who is this?" "My name is Simon." Chapter 13. Owen Hollander, battalion commander for the Anchorage Fire Department, was only vaguely aware of the scale of the chaos in the hospital area. He was acutely aware, however, that Providence Hospital, one of the most important emergency response centers in the city, was burning. The lack of any firm communication from the area caused him even more concern. While he had heard of looting and some possible homicides being committed, he was relatively certain that even looters and murderers would allow a fire engine to pass. Even at their worst, most people recognized the value and benefit of a functioning hospital and would not interfere with firemen trying to do their jobs. With that in mind, he ordered 2 engine companies of firefighters to report to the hospital with a third to stand in ready reserve. These men were dispatched within minutes of the onset of the tumult at the hospital. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen atmospheric interference, he had lost contact with his men shortly after their arrival at the scene. After several attempts, using a wide range of tools to re-establish a communication link, he had decided that he and the 3rd Engine Company would wade into the fray to lend their support to their comrades already engaged. He climbed into his red sport utility vehicle that served as his command vehicle and led the way. As they got nearer, he saw more and more people running from the scene. It must be worse than he originally thought. There were abandoned police cars on either side of the road and other vehicles scattered here and there, some still in the road with engines idling. The sun was still coming up, so he was unsure what the objects were that were lying about, though they seemed eerily similar to bodies. He was suddenly worried that perhaps there had been a chemical spill of some sort that was posing a respiration hazard. He called back on his radio to the engine following him and voiced his concerns about possible toxic fumes in the air. He and the company chief decided that they needed to press on and would observe the strictest caution in their approach. They were soon on Providence Drive and only a handful of blocks from the hospital. It was here that things really began to sour. Owen could see the pulsing lights of one of his engines in the distance. It didn't appear as if it had actually made it to the hospital. He tried to reach his silent teams with his radio and then with his cell phone. Nothing. He was going into the emergency scene completely blind as to what to expect. It was troubling. But he was a firefighter and, as such, was expected to think on his feet and use his better judgment in just such scenarios. He pressed his accelerator and sped ahead of the more cumbersome fire engine. If he could get a better idea of the nature of the emergency, he might be able to better prepare his men for what to expect. He wasn't quite sure what to anticipate himself, but for what he saw, there was no anticipating. One of his dispatched fire engines was just around the bend in the road and just short of the hospital. It was sitting slightly off the road with its lights still flashing. The eerie thing about it was that there was no one around. Not a single one of his men could be seen. There were helmets and some other emergency gear scattered around, but no firefighters. He called again on his radio. Still nothing. He slowed his vehicle to get a better look, then lowered his window and called on his radio again. Even from there, he could hear his voice come from the radio in the open cab of the large emergency vehicle. Then, he saw a body lying face down on the side of the road, wearing a firefighter's heavy coat. He slammed on his brakes and leapt from his truck. Instinctively, he put on his helmet and ran across the road to the fallen fireman. Owen ran through his training and followed the proper routine for approaching a potentially injured person in an emergency setting. He called as he neared him. "Can you hear me? I'm here to help. Are you okay?" There was no response. He picked up his pace and was almost next to the man when he noticed some movement. A group of screaming, fleeing people caught his eye and distracted him for a moment. He looked back down, and the man was slowly lifting himself up onto all fours. Owen leaned down and got an arm under his fallen comrade to help hoist him up onto his feet. His hand was immediately wet and sticky. He withdrew it involuntarily and was disgusted to see that it was covered in blood, rich, bright red blood. He almost fell backward. When the firefighter was fully on his feet but still not facing him, Owen asked cautiously, "Are you okay?" The stricken man spun around and grabbed hold of the battalion chief, sinking his teeth into his cheek. Owen kicked the other man hard in the leg, knocking him off balance enough to get away. He turned to escape, but ran headlong into another person, a woman, whose left side of her face was mutilated. Her eye socket was ripped open horribly, and her eye was gone. Her ear was also missing, and huge swaths of skin from her neck had been shorn away by something. Owen tried to speak, but she was on him before a single word could be uttered. The firefighter still behind him was also grabbing at him as the two pulled him from his feet. His radio was squawking desperately as the fire engine following him arrived on the scene. Chapter 14. After their official, if brief, introductions, Neil and Rachel formulated a plan, deciding what was absolutely necessary should their time be cut short. She was going to get a cart and head toward the canned foods, bottled water, granola bars, and anything else that required the least amount of preparation. He headed for the sports department to look at the guns and camping gear. The sports department was more or less in the middle of the store. Even without the signs pointing him that way, he could have found it by moving toward the fishing poles whose long necks peered up and over the tops of the tall shelving units that delineated shopping aisles. In the midst of the department sat a locked glass cabinet, behind which stood a bank of carefully displayed rifles and shotguns. He had never owned a firearm before, but was not intimidated by them either. He realized, however, that he wasn't entirely sure what to get. He climbed over the counter and was immediately overwhelmed with the varieties. He knew that he wanted at least one hunting rifle with a scope, maybe a couple of shotguns, and at least one smaller rifle. The glass cabinet holding the handguns was also of interest to him. He wanted to have everything that they might need. Deciding on the handguns first, he retrieved a fire extinguisher from a support column and smashed the top of the cabinet. He just started grabbing everything onto which he could lay his hands. He grabbed heavy revolvers and lighter, sleeker automatics. There were some laser sights and other accessories in the bottom, but he elected not to get these. He then moved his shopping cart over to the wall behind, and by the armloads started to empty the shelves of ammunition. He grabbed everything. Not a bit was left. On top of all of this, he piled several rifles, more rifles than he had originally intended. Of course, all of the firearms had locked security bolts, essentially freezing their triggers. Noting this, but deciding to move on and deal with it later, Neil next went to the camping section. From these aisles, Neil put his hands on sleeping bags, hooking them to the outside of the cart. He was just about to pile in a small tent when a voice behind him made him jump.
"What the hell are you doing?"
He turned to see the woman whose voice had startled him. It was the manager, or at least a manager, of the store. She seemed too young to be the general manager, but her name tag, which read Megan, also boasted that she was management. She glared at him with her intense blue eyes, demanding a response. Neil was embarrassed during the brief silence that ensued. Looking down at the shopping cart and at the potential arsenal in it, he was at a loss for words to explain his actions. He was finding it hard to immediately explain to her why he was doing what he was doing. He wasn't quite sure how many laws he had broken, but he was relatively certain that it was more than he could imagine. It just wasn't in his nature to break the law, and yet he hadn't even hesitated to steal and vandalize. More annoyed than anything else, the woman asked,
"What the hell is going on today? Has everyone gone crazy?"
Stuttering, Neil tried,
I mean, first, no one shows up for work this morning. Last time I'm hiring college students that live on campus. I mean, you'd think as close as it was, it would be a snap to get here for work. And then are you looting?"
No. Of this, Neil was adamant. Looting just seemed too random and self-serving. What he had done was self-preserving.
"Have you turned on a radio this morning? Watched the news? Anything?"
Thoughtfully, she answered,
No. My radio is on the blink in my car, and the music in here is a recording.
Knowing that this would be the quickest way to get his point across, Neil suggested,
Why don't you go call the police? I'll come with you.
They went to the front of the store to use the phone at the customer service desk. Megan was careful to go inside the enclosure and leave Neil standing on the store sales floor. In case he was off the deep end, she wanted to have something between her and him, even if it was only the pressboard walls of the customer service island. After she dialed and heard the same recording Neil had heard earlier, she dialed her home number. Same recording. She took her cell phone from her pocket and tried that as well, only to get the same frustrating message. Neil said,
Let's go over to the electronics section and check out the news. Maybe someone is still broadcasting.
Test patterns were on every television from every station. A simple message ran along the bottom that a word from the emergency broadcast system would follow shortly. Megan asked again as she accompanied Neil out to his van, which was parked just outside the doors.
What's going on?
Seriously, almost apologetically, Neil looked her squarely in the eyes and said, I don't honestly know for sure. I just saw the most disturbing and frightening thing I think I could ever imagine. And so, as they finished unloading the supplies he had gathered into the rear hatch and back seat of his van, and then went back into the store to load the cart with other necessities such as matches and fire-starting bricks, batteries, first aid supplies, and anything else they thought might be useful, he told her about what had happened to Rachel and him at their office building. Neil avoided any speculation or editorializing about the events. There really wasn't any point. The facts themselves were staggering enough without side comments. Perhaps it was because of the way that Neil had talked about it, but Megan felt compelled to believe the story. When she saw Rachel pass by with a cart so full she could barely push it, she knew they were telling the truth. There was something that still clung to Rachel's face and eyes. A sense of fear and doubt just seemed to cling to the other woman. They were startled when a new voice shouted from the front of the store.
Hello? Is there anyone here? Can anyone help us?
Neil and Megan pushed their full cart out to the voice, which happened to be on the way to the van parked out front. It was a younger man, not much more than a kid, really, who waited for them by the customer service desk. He had 2 young children who looked wild-eyed and scared with him. Chapter 15. Jerry recounted to the others what had happened at the hospital, allowing Danny and Jules to fill in details of how it all began with poor little Martin and their caveman.
So, we got out to my car in the parking garage, and then there was all this screaming and running all around us. There were people running every which way. Some were chasing and some were fleeing. We were already in our car and moving, so we were able to get the hell out of Dodge before it was too late. There weren't a whole lot of others who were that lucky, though. A bus pulled up just as we got out onto Providence Drive. I don't think the driver could see what was going on because he just opened his doors and waited, like everything was still normal and he was just going to pick up his passengers like any other day. Those things were on there before he could do anything. I think I saw the bus start moving again, but we just wanted to get away fast.
Jules pulled on Jerry's blue paper-thin scrub pants and asked him, but loud enough for everyone to hear clearly,
What about my mom and dad? Where are they? Are they going to be all right?
Jerry couldn't look down at her. He just couldn't bring himself to do that. He knew the probable fate of the little girl's parents. They had been there at the epicenter of all the chaos. He touched her lightly on her head. He swallowed hard, and instead looked at the other adults. The question hung in the air, though, for all of the adults gathering around to hear, and Rachel had by then joined them. Megan was still not sure what was happening. Neil and Rachel had seen an attack and were not sure what they had actually seen other than a very grisly and bizarre murder. Jerry was the only one among them who understood, and even he wasn't entirely able to wrap his mind around the truth. The air was heavy with unease and doubt. They looked at one another for a brief few moments, unsure of what to do. Neil interrupted the silence with, "Okay, unless there are any objections, I think we should try and sort things out somewhere other than here. Does anyone live close by?" Rachel protested with a loud, "Fuck that! Oh, sorry, kids." "Do you have a different idea?" "Everything we need is right here. Why don't we just stay here and wait for—" She trailed off, realizing that she didn't know how to finish her thought. Neil finished it for her. "Wait for what? We're on our own here. This is why I think we should get out of here, and, by the way, the clock on that train is ticking away, so I'll make this brief. This place has too many windows that can be broken and too many lights to draw attention to itself. This place is bad news." Jerry added, "He's right. Rachel, is it? This place would be a death trap. We need to go somewhere that won't attract a lot of people, because where there are lots of people, there will be lots of those things. It's that simple." Megan summed up the decision with, "Okay, then let's get moving. If I'm going to die, I don't want it to be at work." Her candor and dry humor brought a smile to everyone's face as they went back to the parking lot and their awaiting all-wheel drive life raft. When they stepped outside, the sky was getting brighter. The smoke coming from near the hospital appeared to be getting thicker and broader, as if the base of the flames was starting to devour the college campus, as well as the hospital. But the most unsettling thing was the almost totally absent sound of emergency sirens. Not more than 15 minutes prior, the air was filled with the clarion echoes of police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks. Now the only thing in the air was the smell of smoke as the city started to burn. And then there was something else. A hum, really. Jerry had once been to a horse race, and it sounded strangely similar to that. He said uneasily, "I think we'd just better get out of here." Rachel asked, "What is that sound?" and stepped away from the van, trying to see around the corner toward the source of the approaching sound. It grew louder and louder until they could make out what was undoubtedly screams. The chaos had found them and was rapidly headed straight for them. They had to act immediately. Megan fished her keys from her pocket and ran toward her car. Neil shouted after her, "What the hell are you doing?" "I'm not leaving my car here. I'll follow you." She stopped suddenly and ran back to him. "Here," she said, handing him a fistful of keys. "This one should unlock the trigger guards on the guns." Neil smiled and said, "Thanks, and here," passing her one of the two-way radios he had grabbed from the electronics department. "Stay in contact with us. I don't want to lose you." She smiled and ran over to her car, which took several attempts to start. She then bolted over to the Tesoro gas station in the northwest corner of the parking lot. Neil, Jerry, Rachel, and the two kids all loaded themselves into Neil's minivan and followed Megan to the service station. Neil was surprised when he got there to find that she wasn't getting gas. She was corralling two other people, employees at the gas station, into her car. As he pulled up next to her, she gave him the thumbs up, rolled down her window, and asked, "Okay, so now what?" He wasn't entirely sure what was next. They could get on the Glen Highway and head north out of town. They could get on the Seward Highway and head south out of town. As far as getting out of town, those were the only two options. Neil was concerned that if this chaos, like ripples in a pond from a dropped stone, was spreading in every direction, then the highway north might be too snarled with outgoing traffic. He really didn't relish the thought of getting stuck in a traffic jam and then having to beat this storm on foot. The southbound highway was a little more appealing, but once they headed south, they were very limited with any other road travel. Of course, they could just find a good place to hide and wait. But where? Chapter 16. The chaos at Providence Hospital had, by that time, grown exponentially. The University of Alaska Anchorage, immediately adjacent to the hospital, was engulfed by the terrifying wave as it spread further and further into the city. Like a metastasizing cancer, the bedlam sought fertile grounds of hapless victims in the neighborhoods and schools surrounding the university and hospital. The city was still rousing itself from its slumber, so any response by the citizenry was limited at best. Young children waiting for the school bus to pick them up for school, men and women out for their morning exercise jogs or walks, and clueless souls retrieving their morning newspapers were the first victims to fall. Entire neighborhoods were shaken awake by the horrible cries and desperate pleas for help from the latest victims. One woman watched from her bay window as a group of 4 or 5 of the fiends ran down the street chasing after her newspaper delivery man. Not realizing what was happening, she flew to her front door and started to scream at his pursuers as they took him down, while 2 of them pinned him down and started to perform their awful work. The others altered their course and ran at her. She slammed her door heavily behind her just before they were topping the stairs of her front porch. Locking it, she screamed and ran for the phone. In the living room of her condominium, she was able to punch in 911 just as one of her attackers plunged through her bay window and was upon her. She kicked and screamed, but it was no use. She was dragged to the floor as she tried to run and suffered the same fate as every other victim. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood and every other neighborhood bordering the university and hospital area were awakened by screams of terror as the disease, bit by bit, gradually consumed the city. Chapter 17. Dr. Caldwell and his group, now down to just 8 people, were trying to catch their breath on a floor dominated by small labs and private physicians' offices. He and the police officer had not acted upon his suspicions of the effects of the bites, and had instead elected to move the 3 members of their group who had been injured thus. The doctor was always certain to isolate the 3 away from the rest of the group. No point in taking any chances. He could be wrong, but if he was right, he didn't want to invite disaster. 2 floors later, the person who appeared to have the worst bites and who was in rapid decline expired and almost immediately reanimated. The 3 injured people were currently lying on the floor in an office far down the hall from the rest of the group. The living corpse, still lying between the 2 other bitten people, leaned across one of the injured people's laps and started to chew on her thigh, which was showing just below her skirt. Even through her disorienting misery, the victim tried to fend off her attacker. She hit the other woman on the back of the head until she had somewhat relented. Of course, she merely stopped biting her victim on the leg and moved her blood-slathered teeth and lips up to her neck. The 3rd wounded person, a diminutive Filipino man, tried to crawl away using his one good arm to balance himself, though he was unable to make any headway as he succumbed to his dizziness and collapsed onto his stomach. He mercifully passed out and was still unconscious as the 2 others, the 2nd woman having died from her new wounds and reanimated, started to chew on his legs and arms. Soon, the 3 of them were sitting in a thick and growing pool of red that coursed out on the tiled floor and found its way under the door and into the hall. Officer Ivanov, the Anchorage policeman in Dr. Caldwell's group, was dispatched to retrieve the 3 wounded people so the group could continue on. When he rounded a corner, he immediately saw the blood on the floor. He stopped and stood motionless and quiet. The door to the office was still shut, and anything leaving the room would have to pass through the crimson puddle and would thus be forced to leave footprints wherever it trod. There was absolutely no evidence of anyone or anything having left the office. He stood there for a moment or 2, not sure of what to do. He did, however, instinctively remove his pistol from its holster. He couldn't bring himself to just leave without at least verifying his and the doctor's suspicions, so he asked tentatively, "How we doing in there? Anyone awake?" He started to step forward, but jumped back, his eyes wide with shock, when the face appeared in the window of the office door. It was the woman in the short skirt. Her once smooth, dark skin was faded almost gray except around her eyes, which were darker than her skin had been before. Her hungry eyes looked into the hallway and caught sight of Officer Ivanov. From behind the door, he could hear her deep, chesty grunting and moaning that resonated with a primal hunger that turned the police officer's stomach. It was the first time he had ever felt like prey, and the feeling sapped all of his strength. The gray-skinned woman started to press herself against the door, trying to get at her quarry. He couldn't move. He was revolted and terrified and utterly paralyzed. She leaned into the door harder and harder, pressing her face against the glass and streaking it with the blood that had spurted from the open wounds on her neck and onto her cheeks. Dr. Caldwell was then at his side, having responded to the sounds he was hearing. He was standing to the side and slightly behind the police officer when he saw the woman behind the glass. He stood there and watched. Officer Ivanov, never taking his eyes off the woman, asked, "Did you lock that door, Doc?" "No, I'm guessing you didn't either." "Nope." "Maybe that's a good thing. One good piece of news." "And what's that?" The doctor nodded his head and thought aloud. "Perhaps these things are not able to even retain the simplest of motor functions. Opening a door with a turning door handle may actually be beyond them." "Well, how have they been getting through all the doors all day long, then?" "My guess is that—" "Your guess? Your guess? What do you mean, your guess?" "You act like I'm an authority here on this. Until a short while ago, I would have said that all of this was an impossibility that only could happen in science fiction. Again, my guess is that the other doors were opened by sheer weight of numbers. When the door is actually pushed from its frame, it doesn't matter whether they can use doorknobs or not. They're coming through." Out of frustration over not being able to get through, the woman finally smashed her head through the glass of the small window on the door. Still unable to pass through, the only immediate result was that now one of her arms was extending into the hallway and her moaning was that much louder. Her moaning solo soon became a trio as the other two recently expired souls joined her. Dr. Caldwell, shaking his head, unnecessarily uttered, "We'd better get going again. It won't take long for the three of them to force that door open, and the others can't be that much farther behind us now." "Yeah, I know. You know that pretty soon we're going to run out of places to run to, right? We only got so many floors before we get to the top." "I know, officer." "Well, what are we going to do when we get to the top?" "I don't know yet. I'm hoping that Simon has the answers." And with that, a phone in an open office next to them started to ring. Chapter 18. Neil and the group with him were traveling west on Northern Lights Boulevard. That was really the only option left to them after they finally exited the Fred Meyer and Tesoro parking lots. The maelstrom had nearly reached them and was actually beginning to envelop their north and southbound escape routes. Neil just kept thinking to himself, just keep moving. Get away. It didn't matter to where. All that mattered was getting there. Jules looked over the back seat through a crack in the piles of looted supplies. She didn't know what she was looking at or why she was looking anymore. All she knew was that somewhere back there was her family. All of these strange grown-ups were acting scared and really nervous, and that made her scared and really nervous. It was frustrating, though, because she wasn't certain why she was made to feel scared and nervous. Events had unfolded so quickly that she hadn't really been able to keep pace. All that she could really remember was that her brother was sick, and her mom and dad were trying to get him better. If Danny wasn't with her, she doubted that she could be there either. She would have been too scared to go with these strangers, even though they seemed like kind people that only wanted to protect her. She trusted Danny, though. And Danny, he wasn't quite sure what he was feeling. He was terrified of the possibilities, and yet, inside every adolescent boy is a hero myth waiting to play itself out. The hero rising above catastrophe to triumph, and everything always worked out for the best. Sometimes the hero died, but usually he found a way out. That was how the movies were. That was how video games were. He wasn't in any hurry to start volunteering to fight, but then again, the best heroes were always the reluctant champions. He would watch the grown-ups with the guns and learn how they worked. Maybe he could stick close to Neil. He seemed smart, and like he actually knew what was going on. He was the one who had got all this stuff in the back of the van and then put them on the road. Danny hoped that they were on a road out of town, but just to be moving felt good. Unfortunately, there were only 2 roads that led out of Anchorage. The Glen Highway that headed north toward the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, and the Seward Highway that headed south toward the Kenai Peninsula. They were currently on neither road, but they were headed in exactly the opposite direction from which the noise and commotion had come. Danny knew none of the information about the roads. He was keenly aware of the last point and was very grateful for that decision by Neil. Chapter 19. Dr. Caldwell's group was 1 floor away from the roof, but had his hands full with getting there. They were ambushed at the main exit to the roof and were forced to retreat deep into some administrative offices. Unfortunately, most of the doors behind them were glass. He answered the ringing phone on the room's desk. "Hello, Simon." "I don't have much time, and neither do you. Above your heads is a heating duct. If you spread yourselves out enough, it should be able to hold your collective weight. Head north in the duct and find an access panel on your right, about 100 feet in. Go through it, climb the ladder, and you'll be on the roof. Transportation will be there shortly. You've got the last ride out of here, Doctor." "Will we see you there, Simon?" "No. I'm afraid I am trapped in the control room, and it's just a matter of time. Nowhere to go, you know. Glad I could help." The line went dead. "Okay, Simon says we got a way out above our heads, up through the ceiling and into the duct. I guess I should go first, since I know where we're going. Let's get moving right away. He said we haven't got much time." Simon was right. Officer Ivanov was the last up into the duct. He reached back with his foot and kicked away the chair they had used as a boost. Hanging precariously, he saw entire walls of glass come down as their pursuers tracked them relentlessly. The sound was terrific and shook the duct beneath them. The doctor found the access panel and was soon on the roof, but there was nothing there. No magic carpet to ferry them away from danger. How long did they have? He wondered. He looked over the side of the tower to the ground below. It wasn't the tallest building in Anchorage, but it was tall enough to know that it was suicide to jump. Besides, the bedlam below was staggering. It was a scene right out of hell. Neither Milton nor Dante could have imagined a more vivid depiction of absolute terror. And he was about to become a part of it. He vomited over the edge. He leaned into the railing and retched the early morning breakfast he'd eaten. Chunks of moist bagel with a broth of Earl Grey tea sprayed out of his mouth, burning his nose and back of his throat as it exited. He was pretty sure that he was crying, but it didn't even really matter anymore. He stood himself up straight and wiped his face clean with his once white lab coat. He turned and looked at his party of followers. "I'm sorry. There's nowhere left to run. Maybe Simon's chariot already left town without us." His words, voice, and demeanor were all swollen and heavy with regret. The roof access door, not far from where they all stood, was suddenly jarred from the inside. One of the maintenance men, Nestor, said approvingly, "Those doors are locked. Maybe they'll get bored or forget about us or something. Maybe they'll just wander away." Officer Ivanov bit his lower lip and counted his remaining bullets. It wasn't good news. They were defenseless and trapped. Shots suddenly rang out from the opposite side of the hospital. And there, Sitting gracefully and eager on another rooftop was the red, white, and blue air evacuation helicopter, the rotors already starting to turn as the beautiful bird came to life. The shooter, an apparent crewman, was running across the helipad and threw himself into the open side door just as the chopper was lifting into the air. Hot on the heels of the liftoff was a crowd of the monsters, several of which hurled themselves over the edge of the tower as they tried in vain to follow the helicopter. To everyone's relief, the helicopter abruptly turned and nosed itself toward them. It was an excruciating moment before the aircraft was hovering just above them. The pilot lowered the craft slowly and then stopped just short of the surface. Dr. Caldwell correctly surmised that the pilot was not touching all the way down. He and Ivanov helped lift one after the other of their group up into the doorway. Dr. Caldwell was the last to be hoisted onto the helicopter, so he was closest to the still open door as they motored away. From this vantage point, he could truly appreciate the gravity of the situation from which they had been removed. The carnage that he had been able to see while they were still on the tower was merely the tip of the virtual iceberg. The UAA bookstore was smoldering, and its recently refinished parking lot was littered with corpses. Dozens of bodies, some of which were moving, were lying twisted and contorted amongst the bright yellow stripes. Dr. Caldwell knew full well that the moving bodies weren't survivors or merely wounded. They would soon join the ranks of the ghouls that were streaming down Providence Drive below. Early morning motorists that chose to listen to self-help tapes, sales training demos, or CDs instead of the radio drove tragically unaware that they were headed straight into the open mouth of hell. The doctor shook his head in disbelief. The pilot motioned to his headset and then pointed to another hanging on the firewall behind him. The doctor connected the cords as he had done in helicopters in Iraq and gave a thumbs-up signal. The pilot said,
Simon said good luck.
"And Simon?"
I was on with him when those things got through the door. It didn't sound pretty.
Dr. Caldwell chewed the inside of his cheek and nodded.
Hey, Doc, I got some more not-so-good news.
Yeah?
I got about enough fuel with this many people aboard to get us airborne long enough to find another spot to land. I'm guessing Merrill Field is a mess already or soon will be, so I'm not heading us that way.
Dr. Caldwell suggested, "What about out toward Kincaid? Cullis is out that way, and we got Anchorage International between there and here."
Yeah, but that ain't necessarily a good thing, Doc. It could get kinda dicey through there if people are in a hurry getting out of town, you know?
Got any better ideas?
We're on it. One more thing, Doc. Can you help out Stan here? I think he may have had a closer call than he wanted.
What happened? Stan, in the co-pilot seat, looked back and showed Dr. Caldwell the bite wound on his right hand. His flight suit's sleeve was already saturated with blood that was flowing heavily out of the swollen tear in the skin and muscle tissue in the fleshy part of his hand between the thumb and index finger. Dr. Caldwell held his breath and did his best to not betray his feelings and said, "I'll do my best," and smiled. Part 2. Chapter 20. When a voice suddenly began to speak from the radio, everyone in Neil's van was caught off guard. It had been silent for so long, Neil had forgotten that he had left it on. "Emergency information broadcast to follow." A series of familiar beeps and tones then filled the expectant silence as they waited for news. Any news. Another voice, this one sounding more human and less recorded than the previous, began. "Attention, Anchorage. This message is being broadcast from the newly established National Guard checkpoint at the Knik Bridge. A dire state of emergency has been declared for Anchorage and the rest of south-central Alaska. Reports of widespread destruction of public and private property and potential homicides are true. It is recommended that all residents remain at home. Lock all doors and stay clear of windows. Do not, I repeat, do not attempt to evacuate. Escape routes north and south are currently blocked. If you are already on either the Glen or Seward highways, please lock your doors and remain in your cars. Authorities will come to you and escort you safely out. The governor has mobilized the Alaska State National Guard to try and contain the disturbance. At this point, authorities are unsure of the identities of the perpetrators, their resources, or their intentions. Anyone with any information about this group or their leaders is encouraged to contact authorities immediately. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security have been asked to share assistance in bringing this disturbance to a quick close. Security personnel have also been dispatched to secure the Trans-Alaska Pipeline against any potential threats. Neil said quietly, "They think this is a bunch of terrorists with some kind of political agenda. They haven't got a clue." The voice continued, "If you feel that your safety is at all compromised, a list of safe emergency collection sites will follow. If you are able, remain at home and wait for the authorities to resolve this situation. We will continue to broadcast developments as they are reported." More instructions, some speculation, and lists of potential safe sites followed the broadcast. Neil looked in the rearview mirror and caught Jerry's eyes. "They don't know what's happening, do they?" "No." "Jesus. And if they don't figure it out sooner rather than later, this thing will get completely out of control." "And then?" Jerry remembered one of the only lines he could recall from a world literature class he took. "Abandon all hope." Rachel shifted her weight in the passenger seat so that she could turn and face Neil and Jerry. "If they don't figure it out, what about us? We're in the middle of it and I don't have a clue as to what's going on. Will somebody please tell me? And why the hell aren't we going to one of those safe sites?" Reluctantly, Jerry answered, "Those safe sites will act like magnets for those things. They'll be drawn to the noise, the movement, and the smells. We'll be safer if we just keep moving." Still not quite sure what to think or even believe, Rachel nodded her head for lack of any better gesture. She checked her cell phone again and was told once again that all circuits were busy and to please try her call again later. She hoped that her boyfriend was safe. He was a firefighter assigned to Station 4 on Tudor Road. If she could just speak with him, she might be able to calm down at least a little bit. His voice and his demeanor usually had a calming effect on her. She needed that right now. She needed to feel safe. Jules and Danny grew tired of all the grown-up talk. They looked out the side windows at all the businesses and houses they passed. Jules looked over at her companion and asked, "What happened to my mom and dad? Where's Martin? When will we get back with them? Are we still going to be home in time to start school, or do you think we might be able to miss a few days?" Danny said without moving his eyes, "I think you might be getting an extended summer vacation, Jules." "Well, I guess that's all right then. I was going to be in Mrs. Dumont's class, and I hear she's mean." Neil led them from Northern Lights Boulevard and turned south on Minnesota Drive, a wide, major thoroughfare that connected downtown Anchorage and South Anchorage. His intention was to take Minnesota to South Anchorage and then continue further south on the old Seward Highway as far as he was able before getting onto the new Seward Highway. They began to pass motorists who were still carrying on with their normal routines, oblivious to the calamity that was unfolding. Neil flashed his headlights at cars that sped in the opposite direction as him, but his efforts went largely unnoticed. The only responses he did get were bewildered stares, waving smiles, and obscene hand gestures. Minnesota Drive started its trek out of downtown Anchorage heading south, but upon reaching the south side, it abruptly changed course toward the east. The uninterrupted highway drive ended at the intersection with the old Seward Highway. They came to that traffic light and waited for just a second as Neil assessed the possibility of getting on the new Seward Highway and hightailing it out of town. In front of them, they could see the overpass where the new Seward Highway crossed over Minnesota. There were cars, largely motionless, lined up bumper to bumper for as far as they were able to see. Neil was suddenly concerned that he'd made a fatal error in judgment. Maybe they should have headed north instead. Maybe they could have gotten on the Glen Highway ahead of the majority of the cars that were now blocking it. Just as they turned right onto the old Seward Highway and continued their trek south, Jerry watched as, like a snowball growing exponentially as it rolled downhill, a surge of drivers and passengers abandoned their vehicles and started to run. Jerry touched Neil's shoulder and pointed to the commotion. The group watched for just a heartbeat. Like spooked cattle, the motorists stampeded south along the elevated highway. Some along the outside of the lanes were forced over the guard railing on the overpass, and others simply jumped for lack of any better options. Of course, not far behind were the predators that were tracking them. The blaring of car horns was replaced by shrieks of terror. The din rose until it became a single, desperate scream. They didn't need to see any more. But Megan, who had only been told what was happening and hadn't actually witnessed any of it, paused her car briefly. She was speechless. It resembled the images she had seen on CNN of the running of the bulls in Pamplona, Spain. One man carrying a small child started to climb over the railing to flee down the grassy slope. He got one leg over and then was jolted back from something behind him. He pulled himself forward and then, to everyone's astonishment, threw the child, who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. The child hit the grassy incline and rolled down, looking like a ball of flailing legs and arms. Megan started to pull her car out of its turn to go retrieve the child, but stopped herself when she saw 3 others leap over the railing and follow the child. The 3 following didn't appear to be doing so out of concern. Their body language spoke much more like hunters than rescuers. She couldn't bring herself to watch anymore. All she felt was disgust with herself for having done nothing. She turned her car south, rejoined Neil in his flight, and refused to look back again, even when they entered a mixed residential and commercial section of road that completely obscured the highway from view. It was in this area that she heard and then felt the first sputter from her car's engine. She knew immediately that her car and its failing fuel pump were choosing today to challenge her patience. Her boyfriend, actually her fiancé, but they had been engaged for so long that she doubted they'd ever be married, had promised several times to fix it for her. But just like his promise of marriage, this one had gone no further than mere words. She felt herself getting angry with him and even imagined the argument and the excuses. She caught herself in her imaginings, though, and was overcome with concern for him all at once. For all his faults, and he had a few, he was a genuinely good guy to her and didn't actually intend to let her down. He was the night manager of the Tesoro To-Go Mart on Tudor, down near the native hospital, not that far off from where all this had reportedly started. Was he all right? She hated to cry in front of people, especially people that she only knew in passing, so she swallowed her grief and her tears for later. The 2 she had picked up from the Tesoro station were Tony and Kim, cashiers that she saw on most mornings when she stopped in for her morning gas station coffee. There was just something about coffee gotten from a gas station that she craved. She had opined in the past that gas station coffee makers were secretly lacing their brew with heroin, or at least some kind of hyper-caffeine that she just couldn't resist. Both Tony and Kim learned to anticipate her arrival when it was her turn to open the big retail store with which their small station shared a parking lot, and they timed the coffee brewing around her schedule. At least, that was how it appeared to her, and she appreciated that. That was, however, the extent to which she knew them. She didn't even know their last names, and there she was on the verge of tears in front of them. She fought them back for control. And then she felt the hand fall softly on her shoulder. It was Tony, sitting in the back seat and watching her in the rearview mirror. She felt ridiculous and weak. "I'm okay," spilled effortlessly from her lips. "I know you are. I just wanted you to know that we're here, too." Megan, not known for her shy questioning, looked over at Kim and said frankly, "We're here? Are you guys a couple or what?" Kim laughed. "What? Seems like a fair question." It is. It's just that we get it all the time." "So, what's the deal?" Tony answered for them. "I'm gay."
"Oh, I guess that would be a no then."
Kim smiled and corrected them both.
"Tony is the best boyfriend that I've never slept with."
Tony, speaking more effeminately than Megan thought possible for a man of his frame, gasped, "Oh, stop," and then laughed. The two women quickly joined him, their laughter drowning out the monotonous drone of a voice on the radio. The next sputter from the engine caught all their attention and stifled the laughs as quickly as they began. Tony touched her shoulder again and said in his more usual bass voice, "It's going to be okay. We're going to make it." Chuckling uncomfortably, Megan countered, "Make it where?" "Wherever we stop is where we're supposed to be. You can trust in that." Megan wasn't sure what he meant, but realized that it didn't even matter. She was just glad that her two companions were with her. The third and then the fourth sputters caused her heart to skip, but she felt a little better. She pressed the button on the side of the two-way radio and said to Neil on the other end, "I think we've got a problem." Chapter 21. Dr. Caldwell, still wearing his dirt and blood-stained lab coat, leaned toward the open side door of the helicopter. Conscious of their low-fuel predicament, the pilot chose to keep their altitude conservative so that when they did have to land or possibly crash, they wouldn't be that far from the ground. The day was rising leisurely, autumnal laziness winning out over fading summer enthusiasm. Under different circumstances, this would have been a great day. Clear, crisp, calm. The doctor thought back to past mornings. Memories flashed in his mind, like drinking coffee on his family's backyard deck, enjoying the peace before his wife and children arose from bed, absorbing those first moments of day and savoring them for himself. It was different today. Any sense of tranquility or even contentment melted away with a simple glimpse below them. The memories were crowded out of his thoughts by the concern that he harbored for his family. Luckily, his son and daughter were both out of state attending college, but his wife was still at their home on Lower Hillside. He knew that, for the time being at least, he had to focus on the immediate needs of himself and those around him. By the time they were finally lifted off of the roof of the hospital tower, the bedlam that had started in the examination room near the emergency ward was spreading in both directions on the north and southbound Seward Highway. But like Mercury, that sleek quicksilver seeking in every direction at once, the crisis was spreading and deepening and growing. There seemed to be no stopping it. The roar of the turbine engine and spinning rotor blades overhead thankfully muted the carnage. Parking lots, sidewalks, streets and stores, everything. There was only death and dying. The real tragedy was that nearly every person who died brought another living person into the fold of walking death. They passed over a police roadblock of perhaps 6 squad cars just as it was being overwhelmed. There was shooting and running and dying, but still the slaughter continued to spread unabated. Further south on Lake Otis, another larger roadblock was taking shape. There were more than a dozen cars and scores of officers, most armed with shotguns, settling themselves into position. He wished they could yell down to them that there was no stopping this. The best they could all hope for was to get out of the way and hope that the storm would pass. Stan, the co-pilot with the bite on his hand, appeared to be holding his own for the moment. Though wrapped in several layers of bandages, blood still seeped mercilessly from the wound. Dr. Caldwell, regardless of the other man's attitude and dedication, knew that soon Stan would get sick, become sicker, and mostly incapacitated, die, and then reanimate. There didn't seem to be any reversing the process. For the time being, though, Stan was doing what he could to help, and Dr. Caldwell decided that he could let the inevitable cook on a back burner. The pilot pointed toward the west at an open field just south of O'Malley Road. A 4-lane highway of sorts in South Anchorage. The field had what appeared to be soccer goals on it, but it also appeared to be largely flat and open. It was also far enough away from what was happening in town that their group stood a fair chance of being able to safely escape the carnage. They were just moments away, but the desperate flashing of a red light on the pilot's control panel of a sudden loss in power by the motor led the doctor to believe that they might not make it. The helicopter's turn was sudden and direct. The pilot apologized into his microphone headpiece, but only Dr. Caldwell and Stan could hear it. Both helicopter crewmen flicked switches and turned dials as they tried to coax enough fuel and momentum out of the bird to get them to the field. Dr. Caldwell knew immediately that they were out of fuel, and the landing ahead of them would be rough at best. Using hand signals, he instructed the other passengers to strap themselves in and brace themselves for a crash. One woman grabbed an extra helmet from an open stowage compartment and pulled it over her well-sculpted hairdo. She took off her glasses and put them in the front pocket of her silk jacket. Her eyes caught the doctor's, and they paused. They didn't say anything. Not that either of them would have been able to hear it anyway. Dr. Caldwell nodded and forced a smile, which she returned. A sudden jolt from the struggling aircraft erased both of their smiles, though, as quickly as they appeared. The helicopter's engines gave out just as they crossed over O'Malley Road. The pilot conducted a controlled but powerless landing, trying to soften the impact as much as possible. Even so, when they hit, it was violent and jarring to everyone on board. The passengers in back were jolted, but for those able to use them, their safety harnesses were mostly effective in keeping them from suffering major damage. Equipment fell against them hard, eliciting screams and cries which the doctor could hear in the absence of any engine noise. Falling on its side as it finally came to rest, the helicopter was immediately smoldering and threatening to begin to burn. Shaking his head clear, Dr. Caldwell hoisted himself up and peered out the open side door that was now facing up to the sky. The acrid smoke beginning to fill the cabin seeped out the door, allowing the air to clear enough to breathe without coughing. The doctor leaned forward into the stubby cockpit. Stan was quite obviously dead, his neck broken and twisted horribly. The pilot, whose name the doctor still did not know, was unconscious and slumped forward in his seat. Much of the nose of the craft had been crushed inward, concealing the crew's legs. He heard the spark and fizzle of electrical fuses as, one by one, they burned out. "Okay, we don't have much time. We all know what we need to do. Let's get out and keep moving." He looked back at the others to register a response. He saw 3 faces looking back at him. The woman wearing the crew helmet, Officer Ivanov, and another woman wearing blue nurse's scrubs. A 4th person, another woman, was crying softly and holding her leg. There had been 3 others in the helicopter when they left the hospital. He looked around and found a pair of legs protruding from beneath a pile of heavy equipment that had fallen. He touched an exposed ankle with his first and second fingers and felt no pulse. Where were the others, he wondered. Officer Ivanov unlatched his harness and then set about helping the others with theirs. They each climbed out while Dr. Caldwell attended first to the woman with the injured leg, and then he tried to get an angle to help the pilot. The quarters were agonizingly cramped, making it almost impossible to do anything. The pilot's pulse was strong, but he still evaded consciousness. Attempts by the police officer and the doctor to free the trapped man were to no avail. "Well, what do you want to do, Doc?" asked the police officer as he reached back into the cabin from his straddled perch on the outside of the aircraft. Dr. Caldwell wasn't sure. He looked all around for anything that might be able to be used to get some leverage. He was still looking when he heard the first sound come from the cockpit. Assuming it was the pilot, he said over his shoulder, "I'll be right there, buddy. Hang in there." He finished, rummaging through a compartment, looking for any remnants of supplies that he could forage. "Hey, I was hoping that you might be able to help me with the radio. Maybe we could call—" It was then, in mid-sentence, that he realized that it wasn't the pilot that he was hearing. It was Stan, who was still sitting in the co-pilot chair. He was still strapped in and aligned to be facing forward, but his neck was broken and twisted in such a way as to have his head hanging loosely on his right side and looking back at the doctor. Spying the doctor with his hungry eyes, he began to gnash his teeth and reach forward, trying to grab him. Luckily for the doctor, the direction that Stan's eyes were looking and the direction that his hands were reaching were opposite from one another. The creature, however, was unable to make the connection. He became desperate, shaking his seat and creating a horrible sound that chilled the doctor to his very soul. He was immobilized, a virtual deer in the headlights. And his eyes, there wasn't a shred of humanity in their depths. Behind the expanded black pupils lurked a preternatural hunger whose shadow was made all the more dark by the translucent hot rage glowing in the white corneas around it. The absolute fear that gripped the doctor sickened him, weakened his knees, and made his head swoon. He had no will whatsoever. He could only remember feeling like this only once before, and it was when he had contracted malaria while in Madagascar. The fever damned near cooked his brain. He had lain on his cot, hearing the drips of sweat that ran down his arms and legs and fell to the floor. He could hear each individual drop as it splashed in the ant-sized swimming pools his sweat was forming on the floor under him. At night, when the sweating and fever really applied themselves, he could swear that it sounded like it was raining under him. Yet he couldn't hear anything anyone said to him and barely registered events as they unfolded around him. He had felt like he was floating and merely a spectator, counting the drops of water as they fell. It was the closest thing to an out-of-body experience he could claim to have had. It took the sound of Officer Ivanov reaching back inside to investigate the doctor's delay to jar Dr. Caldwell from his trance. The police officer shook the doctor and then began to pull him from the craft. As he finally emerged, Dr. Caldwell started to struggle to go back inside. The pilot is still alive. I've got to get back in there." It was at about that time that Stan, or that thing that used to be Stan, was finally able to shake himself enough to readjust his head and neck. With still no bones to hold his head erect, he swung it around to enable himself to get at the warm flesh that the heightened olfactory nerves in his nose detected. His head dipped and bobbed until he found the right angle to be able to sink his teeth into his former partner's shoulder. He bit through the pilot's jumpsuit, undershirt, and the skin beneath. Thankfully, the pilot never regained consciousness as the geysers of blood from his torn arteries sprayed themselves across the inside of the large helicopter windshield. From atop the side of the crashed helicopter, Dr. Caldwell could see two other lifeless bodies lying close to one another on the soccer field. He looked more closely, hoping to catch signs of life. When he looked at Officer Ivanov, though, the policeman shook his head. The doctor knew that could mean only one thing: 2 more bodies and 2 fewer survivors. Falling onto his hands and knees beside the aircraft, the doctor was at a loss as to what to do. His head swirled with a confusing mix of anger, doubt, fear, and a host of other emotions, along with the most recent image of horror he had just witnessed in the helicopter. What was happening? Where could they go now? Would there be any end to this? He dug his fingers into the still dew-damp grass and soft, moist soil. The cool morning air kissed his neck and chilled the beads of sweat still standing there and brought the hair on his arms and back to full attention. And then he heard it again. For what seemed to be the millionth time yet that day, someone said to him, "Doctor, I think we have another problem here." He let the defeated, weary laugh creep out of him softly as he remained in the same position. A few tears, those few he still had left in him, escaped to the corners of his eyes and fell harmlessly and silently to the ground in front of him. He composed himself, putting on his doctor's smile, and leaned over the woman lying near. "What's your name?" Through clenched teeth, the dark-complexioned islander answered, "Sulamai, but you can call me Vanessa." She was still rubbing her leg and breathing in quick, controlled, labored breaths. "Okay, Vanessa, where on your leg does it hurt the most?" She touched her ample right thigh and said, "Right here. Oh, it hurt real bad." The doctor could tell that her leg just wasn't right. Between the angle at which it sat and an alarming knot on the middle of her thigh, he was fairly certain that her femur was broken. He also knew that significant damage to that bone especially could lead to a number of other more serious concerns down the road. Of course, under different circumstances, he'd just order a leg x-ray and help steer her toward a speedy recovery. Unfortunately, these were anything but normal circumstances. In considering their options and needs, he also realized that if they didn't get moving quickly, that damage to her femur would be the least of her concerns. Dr. Caldwell stood up and, with the ruckus inside the helicopter still serving as his backdrop, he said, "Okay, folks, we've made it this far together. We've got to keep pushing." He pointed up toward the park entrance, which was clearly visible and a little less than a mile of gradual incline up and out. "There are houses and people who can help us up that road. We've got to keep moving. Officer, if you and I help Vanessa, I think we can make it. Vanessa, you up for this?" Vanessa looked up at the doctor, and her tears went from those of pain to those of resignation. She shook her head slowly and shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know, Doctor. I don't know if I can keep going." Dr. Caldwell, feeling his already diminishing reserves of patience fading further, leaned over her and said, "If we leave you here, you will die. Do you understand that? And if we wait and debate this any longer, then we're going to die too. I need you to help us so that we can all get out of here alive. All right?" She continued to cry and looked back down at the ground. "How are you going to move me?" "We'll figure it out. We've gotten this far, haven't we? You ready?" She took a deep breath and held it, but made no move whatsoever. "Vanessa?" She thought about her younger sister, who was still in school, and about her mother, who was at home with her younger cousins, wondering if they were all still safe. Her family lived in the Mountain View area on the northeastern side of Anchorage. Maybe the police would get all of this in hand before it got to her family. She found the small gold crucifix around her neck and went searching for the strength of her pastor. He always seemed to be so well composed regardless of the situation. Nothing seemed to ever faze him. "No, Doctor. I think I'm just gonna stay right here for a bit. If you get a car and want to come back and check on me, that'd be fine with me, but I think I'll stay." "Vanessa?" "Doctor, we both know full well that I weigh more than both you and Mr. Police Officer Man there put together. There's no point in denying that. You guys'd never be able to move me, not without help anyway. No, I think I'll just stay here for a bit and wait." "Vanessa, we may not be able to get back down here." "That's okay, Doctor. If you can, you know where I'll be." "Vanessa, I can't." She silenced him with her calm expression. If she harbored any fear at all, he couldn't detect it. He was completely disarmed by her resolve. He leaned down and hugged her tightly and kissed her on the cheek. She giggled playfully and said, "Doctor, please, people will talk. I've got my reputation to think about." He smiled at her, touching her shoulder gently. She asked, "If you got anything there in that bag to help with the pain, I would appreciate that." "Sure." Dr. Caldwell opened the large medical kit from the helicopter and found a syringe with painkiller in it. "Would you like me to do it?" Never losing her smile, she answered, "Yeah, if you could. How many of those things are in there?" He handed her 2, and then one more syringe, suspecting what her intentions were but not wanting to confirm. Hippocrates just did a somersault in his grave. "Yeah, I'll sleep good with these, won't I?" The doctor nodded his head as he injected the first tube into her leg. She looked around at the group and said, "Good luck, and don't you all worry about me. I'll be just fine." The 4 remaining survivors from Providence Hospital trudged up the paved road leading away from the soccer fields and toward the traffic light at the entrance to the park. The pavement was damp, as were the waist-high plants and bushes to either side of the road. There were scores of geese on the open field and fenced baseball diamond to their right. Their honking, typically considered obnoxious by the doctor, was a welcome reminder of more normal times. The geese, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening, were just enjoying a brief stopover in Anchorage as they made their way south for the winter. The doctor wondered what the geese would see when they got to their final destination. Was this happening elsewhere, or just in Anchorage? Chapter 22. Neil and his group were just getting themselves out of harm's way when the storm of destruction started to reach them. Luckily, Megan was able to cajole her car enough to get it off of the old Seward Highway and onto a side street that opened into a neighborhood of houses and duplexes. It was just another typical Anchorage neighborhood. Most of the homes looked as if they had been constructed during the 80s, many showing the wear of the past decades. It had the feeling of a ghost town to all of them. There were open front doors and garage doors all up and down the street. There were clothes strewn across lawns, children's toys laying on their sides in driveways, and, most strikingly, absolutely no people. News of the unfolding disaster must have reached the residents and encouraged them to get away, despite the broadcast's simple message of get inside and stay inside. Megan's car came to a rolling stop. She jammed the gear shift into park even before they were completely stopped. Tony and Kim could tell immediately that this was a frustration that wasn't new to Megan. She turned the key in the ignition and gently tapped the gas pedal the way that Landon, her boyfriend, had done in the past to try and convince the car to start. It hadn't worked any better for him than it was for her right now. The engine sputtered and coughed, but there was no starting it. Not now, anyway. If she were able to sit and wait, the car would start readily in about 15 minutes. Judging by the rising din of noise coming up behind them, she didn't think that she could spare even 15 seconds. She knew that it was time to give up. She looked over at Neil's minivan, which was reversing toward them. Over the radio, Neil's voice pleaded, "Get yourselves out of there! Leave the goddamn car!" He was right, and Megan knew it. She grabbed the keys from the ignition, stuffed them in her pocket, and asked, "You two ready?" Like panicked rodents scurrying from the light, Megan, Tony, and Kim leapt from the stalled car and ran in search of safety and a place to hide. Neil slowed the reversing minivan and looked over his shoulder at his scared passengers already in the rear of the vehicle. "Make some room. We've got company joining us." There wasn't really any room to be made, though. The minivan was full. Jerry and the 2 kids pressed themselves as far to one side of the bench seat as they could. In the end, they just moved into the small space between the bench seat and the passenger side sliding door. Jerry was standing but was stooped at the waist. Jules and Danny cowered beneath the arch that Jerry's leaning upper torso created. There was no getting in the back seat as it was filled very nearly to the ceiling with supplies. Megan, perhaps involuntarily but most certainly unbeknownst to her while she did it, let out a shrill scream as she ran to the other vehicle and didn't stop until Tony pulled the driver's side sliding door shut behind him. Looking around at the others, she laughed and cried at the same time. She nodded to Neil and then let the tears take her all at once. Tension, anxiety, and fear tickled all of her nerves and senses at the same time, and she quaked and shuddered all over at once. Jules began to cry, too. Already pressed against Danny, she laid her head on his chest, looking for some comfort, any comfort. She was so confused, and now with this lady crying, she just couldn't control it anymore. And not knowing why she was crying made the tears come even easier. Sorrow, bitter, heavy, and humid, filled the cabin as they made their way into the neighborhood. It was a fitting backdrop for their trek and the day that was still unfolding. It was still early enough in the morning that most people would just then be starting their day. Of course, for all of them in the car, the day had already been long and full. The refuge they sought was there in that neighborhood. The house sat on a cul-de-sac at the terminus of a dead-end residential street, which was just around the corner and still in sight of Megan's abandoned car. There were trees and large hedges in most of the yards. One house, the largest on the street, had a carefully laid pile of enormous stones on either side of its driveway. The house they finally settled on was chosen for the simple reason that its garage door was standing open. Apparently, the owners had fled in a hurry, much like the majority of Anchorage's residents. The front yard and driveway were littered with hastily packed suitcases, shirt sleeves and pant legs hanging lazily out of partially opened seams. In the backyard, barking was obviously the family dog, confused as to who all these people were and where its humans might be. Neil pulled the minivan into the garage and got out to shut the door. Rachel, Jules, and Danny went inside to some upstairs windows that overlooked much of the immediate neighborhood. With the kids still looking out, Rachel went to the kitchen and started foraging through cabinets until she found what she sought. She pulled a big, more than half-full 1 3/4-liter bottle of Stolichnaya vodka from a cabinet and took a long and full drink directly from the bottle. The liquor hit her empty stomach like a hammer and sent her to the floor, partially gagging, almost immediately. She had had enough, and the vodka was the final straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. She started to cry, and in trying to fight back the tears, her crying became sobbing. Neil, meanwhile, peeked his head into the van. Other than Rachel and the 2 kids, no one had moved. It didn't look as if any of them could without causing an avalanche of plastic, cardboard, and aluminum packages to come crashing down around the others. In all of the starting and stopping, the stacks of supplies had shifted and shifted again until they all but engulfed the passengers in the 2 back seats. Neil said with a slight smirk creeping onto his face, "I know just what to do. Nobody move." His weak attempt at humor brought only rolling eyes and perhaps a strained groan from one of them, but they did as instructed, patiently awaiting the details of Neil's brilliant plan. Neil ran around to the back of the van and opened the rear hatch, and sure enough, as he did, the mountain of pilfered retail goods teetered back, falling to the ground around Neil's feet. He suddenly found himself standing knee-deep in an assortment of camping supplies, tools, ammunition and firearms, and boxes, bags, and cans of food. The smirk growing into a full smile, Neil said, "Maybe we should organize all this stuff. I gotta warn all of you, though, I was never very good at putting the groceries away. I'm gonna need some help." Jerry said as he stood, "I'll help with that. You did the shopping. I guess I can put it away." Neil suggested, "I think maybe we should leave some of the non-perishable food and a couple of pistols with ammo in the van, just in case." Jerry repeated, "Yeah, just in case. Hell, maybe we should put all of what we can in the van and then just work on eating whatever doesn't fit." "Hell of an idea," Neil heartily agreed. In the garage, the others started unloading the remaining supplies from the minivan and stacking its already disgorged contents into semi-organized piles, guns and ammunition to one corner, food and water in another, and miscellaneous materials such as batteries, blankets, flashlights, matches, and whatever else in still another pile. They then proceeded to pack behind the last seat and between the 2 front seats bottled water, canned soups, bags of chips and crackers, and boxes of dry cereal. Under the front passenger seat, Jerry tucked a pair of black semi-automatic pistols and a case of shells. Jerry found the touch and feel of the pistols to be energizing in a dangerous way. He couldn't believe he was slipping pistols under a seat. He wasn't sure what he was feeling other than simply anxiousness. It didn't matter the cause. It could have been the guns, but it could have been any number of things. So much had happened already in the span of just a handful of hours, and the gun in his hand convinced him that much more was still to come. Shutting the driver's side door, Neil looked around at the others and asked, "Who is willing to help me go out back and bring firewood inside?" Megan stood back up from the pile of firearms and, dumbfounded, asked, "Are you out of your fucking mind? You're the one that told me what was going on, and you want to go back out into it?" "It's going to start getting cold at night, and we've got no idea how long we will be on our own. I think we ought to get as much wood inside now before—" "Before what?" Neil looked at Jerry for confirmation of his fears. Jerry nodded and continued for Neil. "It's just a matter of time before those things realize we're in here. This is a good place, only a couple of windows down low, a fenced backyard, and a fireplace. That's all good. But he's right. We've got to be ready to be in here for a bit so that all of this can settle down." Jerry knew, though, that there really wasn't any possibility of this just going away. None of the movies or games that he had seen involving zombies had ever ended well. He at least held some small comfort in the fact that he and Neil knew what was happening. In the movies and even in the games, the characters never seemed to have a clue. Maybe that fact alone would be enough to carry them all through this. He knew Neil was right, though. They needed to do what they were able while there was still time. Jerry, Tony, and Neil hurried into the backyard. The woodpile was just outside the door, which was good news. Neil started to toss logs into the garage while Jerry looked around the backyard. He headed toward a small storage shed without doors near the edge of the fenced yard. While his heart was threatening to crawl out of his mouth, the 6-foot wooden privacy fence lent a small degree of comfort. He looked over his shoulder as he crept forward. Tony stood watch with one of the shotguns at the ready in front of him. Neil, too, was armed with a handgun slung in one of the shoulder holsters he'd grabbed at Fred Meyer. He was grabbing and throwing pieces of split birch, but looking up every few seconds to scan the fence for any threats. While they did that, Megan and Kim went through the house to find any containers into which they could collect water from the faucet. Neil was concerned that they would soon lose electricity and then water service, as no one would be left to operate those utilities. Rachel, Danny, and Jules turned on the television and radio to see if any news was forthcoming yet. In the shed, Jerry found a small stash of lumber, scraps of 2x4s, 2x6s, and some pieces of plywood. All of this was carted into the garage as quickly as possible. With some of the firewood and lumber having been moved inside, a fairly hysterical Rachel, who was still drinking from the bottle of vodka, suddenly summoned the 3 men upstairs. "Oh my God, get up here, quick! Hurry!" Jerry leapt to the stairs, barely touching foot to the carpet. They could see, through a space between trees, the old Seward highway where it passed by the little neighborhood. There were still a couple of cars that were trying to make headway, but the vast majority of what they saw were people, hundreds of them streaming like a chaotic parade down the road. They all heard the train-like sound that actually rumbled and shook the house with the same force as a small trembler. Interlaced in the deep roar, just below that rumbling surface of sound, were barely discernible screams and shouts. Megan ran down to the front door and was all set to open it. She yelled, "We gotta do something!" Neil and Jerry simultaneously shouted down at her not to open the door. Neil continued, "You're right, though. We do gotta do something. This house isn't ready yet. We gotta cover those windows downstairs and reinforce that door. We gotta bunker ourselves in." Disbelieving, Megan asked, "We're not gonna do anything for all those people?" "What do you propose we do? I'm assuming you saw what was happening on the overpass? There were hundreds of people there and they weren't able to do anything. What can the 6 of us do? Besides, if we were to save someone from over there on the road, how do we decide which one or ones to save? We haven't got room for everyone here. We haven't got supplies to sustain the few of us for any length of time. How are we going to feed more?" It wasn't like Neil to speak that bluntly or to be that emphatic. He was typically that guy that nodded during office meetings and merely consented to and with the majority on any issues that arose about which he probably should care. So to say that he was uncomfortable speaking in such a manner was a gross understatement. The looks that he got from Megan, Rachel, and the confused children only added to his discomfort. "I'm sorry. Before anyone else could speak, or for the mood of the room to change, Rachel attacked the quiet. "You're right, and we all damned well know it. Sorry, kids."
Jules asked. "Why do you always say sorry after you swear? Wouldn't it just be easier not to swear?" "You're probably right, kid. So what about it, Neil? What do we do?" She took another quick swig from the bottle. Her face was as red as a tomato, but her mood had thankfully settled quite a bit. The group set about deciding how to best use the limited lumber and plywood supply. They had enough pieces of plywood to cover the only 2 downstairs windows. They decided to put the plywood on the outside of the windows and then use interior doors from the house to cover the inside of the windows. If they could keep the windows intact, the cooler nights might not be so cool inside. Of course, the doors would have to be hung later. Their time outside was running out, and they all knew it. They worked with the desperation of dike builders along the banks of a swelling river in the midst of a storm. The job was quick and dirty, but it was solid. Inside, they worked in pairs to nail 2x4s across door frames. The garage door was of heavy construction and insulated. It appeared strong and resilient. Danny, perched in the upstairs window, kept a vigilant watch through binoculars on the passing horde on the highway. He stood there watching quietly, never taking the glasses from his eyes. In the background, he could hear the television, which had begun to broadcast again. It was hard for him to watch the television because all the grown-ups on it seemed so afraid, and they kept talking about places he had never heard of. Knik, Eagle River, Seward, Fort Somewhere, and something Air Force Base. None of the news seemed good. It was just easier for him to try and ignore the speaking and watch the road for any bad news coming their way. Chapter 23. It had been only a handful of hours since Martin Hauser had been admitted to the Providence emergency room. Already, though, the city was ready to come apart at the seams. The main roads were filling up with cars that sat bumper to bumper, hopelessly trapped in clogged pavement arteries. A precious few jets and large commercial aircraft were still able to depart Anchorage from the international airport. Merrill Field, the state-of-the-art small plane airport on the northern side of the city and just east of downtown, was already in ruins. There were wrecked planes, smoldering fuel and equipment trucks, burning control and office buildings, and throngs of staggering, broken souls shuffling across the tarmac. Small Cessnas and Pipers and a number of other single-engine aircraft were still coming in irregular waves and trying to land, the pilots obviously unaware of the bedlam unfolding below. One plane, a single-engine Cessna, wobbled down a runway. Out of control and hampered by the added weight of several extra bodies clinging to the wings and sides of the aircraft, the pilot wheeled his plane through a fence opening just wide enough for his exit. Of course, the narrow opening would not accommodate the wings of his plane, so they smashed into and partially through the high stone wall and light poles to either side of the thruway. Emerging like a magician through a flash of smoke and dazzling electrical sparks, the fuselage of the small plane burst into view. The pilot emerged onto traffic-choked Fifth Avenue, a major thoroughfare through downtown and a natural artery out of town. He steered the plane capably at first, but the teetering imbalance of moving the extra bodies was too much. The plane drove into the side of a shiny new Humvee, which was pushed into another large sport utility vehicle that ended up on its side. The result was that both inbound and outbound lanes were blocked, and all the cars waiting to get out of town were suddenly trapped. At first, there was a chorus of horns from farther back down the line of cars. This was soon followed by desperate, screaming voices as those closest to Merrill Field tried to flee from the wave of death that was spilling out onto the road. Men, women, and children abandoned their vehicles and started running. Most fled without direction, just trying to get away. Many were trampled beneath panicked feet. Others were caught and set upon by their assailants. Some drivers tried to maneuver their automobiles through the maze to make their escape. This only served to tighten the traffic knot even further. There was no control and no restraint from anyone.
The police were being victimized at an alarming rate as those men and women tried to protect the civilian population and found themselves overwhelmed time and time again. More and more gunshots rang out as ordinary citizens tried to stand their ground. Many innocent people were wounded or even killed as most of the shooting became random. People fleeing on foot made their way to the bridge spanning Ship Creek and connecting Anchorage to Elmendorf Air Force Base. Mothers carrying children wrapped in blankets, fathers tugging older children by the hand, and individuals all swarmed across the bridge looking for safety. A pair of military police Humvees met the mob approximately halfway across the bridge. The soldiers, armed with M4 automatic rifles, fired their weapons into the air to absolutely no effect. The crowd didn't hesitate for even a moment. They couldn't. There was only the smallest of divides between them and their attackers. If they paused, they would have been caught. The soldiers, 12 in all, let the civilians pass, as if there was any possibility of doing otherwise. Shortly on the heels of the first group was a second group of people. At least, from a distance, they looked like people, but Lieutenant Van Dorfman wasn't entirely sure about that as he looked down his binoculars at them. They looked somehow different. It wasn't just the torn clothing, blood stains, or odd walking that they did that caught his attention. It was something more about the expressions on their faces that caught him off guard. Even from this distance and through binoculars, he could make out their faded, vacant, and empty expressions. There was not a single indication that any of them were anything more than upright corpses, except for something that boiled around and in their eyes. As soon as the refugees had cleared their field of fire, the soldiers started shooting. The staccato crack of their gunshots was, at first, reassuring to the survivors now behind their line. Some even slowed their pace and turned to watch the professionals do their jobs. The first rank of pursuers, riddled with crimson patches, fell to their knees, but most were quickly up and moving forward again. Even with automatic weapons, body armor, and military training, the soldiers were overwhelmed as quickly as any other force that sought to stand up to the onslaught. Lieutenant Dorfman tried to radio command that their line had been breached, but as he turned away from the utter carnage that was being reaped upon his men, he too was attacked. From his headset comlink that was still open, he broadcast nightmarish bubbling and gurgling as his tongue was ripped violently from his mouth. Death did not come quickly enough for the unfortunate young soldier. There just seemed to be no stopping the infection from spreading. There were fires burning, most out of control, all across the city by now, the smoke adding a constricting pall that laid itself as comfortably over buildings as it did over bodies lying in the middle of streets and roads. Anchorage was envisioned and created in the second decade of the 20th century, and it took nearly 100 years for the city to become a thriving metropolis replete with modern business and retailers and nearly 300,000 residents. Several hours were all it took for this center of population for the state of Alaska to be brought to its proverbial knees. There was no order, as most of the police force had been victimized early on trying to stand their ground. There were already ghouls wearing police uniforms amongst the horde of undead, testament to the ultimate sacrifice many of the officers paid. Several fire stations were identified as safe sites by the radio, and, just as Jerry predicted, those stations became beacons for the ghouls. They flocked to the sites like sharks, responding to the faint scent of blood in the water. The Bear Valley Fire Station was the lone holdout, but it was no longer functioning as it was intended. Dozens of people had sought refuge there as promised by the radio. The station head, having lost contact with every other station as well as all other emergency personnel in the city, knew that something had to be done. They could wait and hope for relief, or they could flee. He decided to split the difference and do both. As many civilians as possible were loaded onto their biggest engines to make a run for safety. Those unable or unwilling to leave did their best to seal themselves inside the station in hopes that help was on its way. Chapter 24. Dr. Caldwell knew that he was out of shape and not fit enough to really exert himself anymore. He hadn't been athletically active in years, and it showed. It was no great surprise, then, that he found himself out of breath before he had even cleared the first parking lot that was at the very end of a long and steep road leading out of the sports park. The thing that concerned the doctor even more than his own shabby performance was that no one else was even able to keep up with him. He stood there, panting and out of breath, waiting for the others. He was glad that he had stopped smoking, but wished he had done it long ago instead of just recently. He didn't want to quit, really, but he just got sick of hearing them complain and point out all the obvious health threats.
I mean, really, Dad, you're a doctor. You, above everyone else, should know. And what about secondhand smoke?
And blah, 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 blah. It had worked, though. He'd quit a little more than 9 months ago, and now the craving for a cigarette was the worst that it had been since having quit. It was no use, though. He didn't have any and couldn't get any. He might as well just push on past the craving and deal with it. His 3 companions, the only survivors to escape the massacre at Providence Hospital, were making their way as quickly as they were able across the parking lot. One of the women, Emma, was still wearing the extra helicopter crew helmet she put on just before crashing. She was struggling to run, primarily due to her choice of footwear. She finally stopped and kicked off her high-heeled shoes, opting instead to run with hose-covered feet. Her pace increased substantially until she was standing next to the waiting doctor. The other 2 joined them, and they continued on. This time the doctor chose to move with the group rather than on his own, knowing that they needed to stay together if they hoped to get out of this situation alive. They speed-walked up the inclined road toward the main road. Coming from out of sight but nearby, they could hear a sound that resembled a train but was not industrial. The sound was full and constant, like an engine, but was absent any of the typical trappings of a mechanical source. Luckily, it sounded as if the noise was still some distance away. It was, however, approaching. Officer Ivanov opined, "It sounds like a stampede." Dr. Caldwell couldn't have summed it up better. It did sound like a stampede. Frightened, horrified animals fleeing for their lives. "Do you think it's heading this way?" Dr. Caldwell was wondering the same thing, but also wondered if it wouldn't be better if they were just able to avoid the stampede altogether, knowing full well that the stampede was more than likely Anchorage citizens dashing for safety. There just didn't seem to be any benefit in moving in large groups right now. Sure, there was safety in numbers, but the numbers had to be manageable. He didn't want to be a virtual lemming being run off the cliff. The doctor told them that he thought they should just find some temporary but safe shelter and wait this out for a while. Directly across from the park was a small neighborhood with 2 rows of houses facing one another and a single road separating them. That seemed to be their best option, so they headed down the road. A small Subaru wagon with significant rust around the wheel wells sped toward them. The doctor stood out in the middle of the road to flag down the vehicle for help. He stood there until the last moment when he realized that the driver was neither slowing nor swerving to avoid him. He stepped out of the way of the oncoming vehicle at the last moment and watched it speed away from them without even looking back. At the stoplight, the car veered sharply to the right and then was out of sight. Further down the road, another vehicle, a smallish sport utility vehicle, screeched out of its driveway and started toward them as well. This vehicle, too, was screaming up the road at top speed. As it approached them, though, the driver slowed slightly and lowered his passenger side window. He shouted, "The end is upon us! Repent!" and then continued away. It was from the house that the second vehicle had driven away from that the group finally decided upon to stop. Entering through a back door, the 4 of them paused to catch their breath. Emma went upstairs and turned on a television, hoping for some news. The amazing thing, she discovered, was that most of the channels still had regular programming. Reruns of Days of Our Lives still played out on the Soap Network. Hitler was still bombing Leningrad on the History Channel. Rachel Ray was still cooking up some concoction on the Food Network. It was as if life was still proceeding normally everywhere else. Emma decided that was positive news, reasoning that these channel sources were outside of Alaska. That probably meant that the problem was localized to Alaska and possibly to Anchorage. That seemed like it was a good thing. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Dr. Caldwell checked the phones. Out of service. Officer Ivanov grabbed some bread, some peanut butter, and, lacking jelly, some honey from the pantry to put together some sandwiches. He also grabbed a nearly full bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream and 4 styrofoam cups. The fourth person in their party, a woman by the name of Dana, went immediately to the bathroom and hadn't been seen since, though occasionally all of them could hear her sobbing. It was okay, though. They all felt like that. The doctor was just spent emotionally. As he watched the images from the local news networks splay themselves across the screen, he might as well have been watching the Food Network or possibly the Weather Channel. None of it was new. It barely caught his attention, until the reporter began to talk about the line of defense that seemed to be holding. "What was that last bit?" Emma, still wearing the helmet, peeked up at him from beneath the red, white, and blue paint on her headgear and welcomed him back with a smile. "They've set up some kind of barrier at the Knik Bridge crossing." "Barrier my ass. I bet they've blown the bridge. I wonder how long they can hold there." "Who's holding there? Is there any news or advice for holdouts in Anchorage?" "The last thing I heard the guy say about it was that authorities had lost all contact with Anchorage. It didn't sound too good. Sounded like maybe we might be it." "What about Fort Richardson and Elmendorf?" "Those that were able were evacuated. There is still sporadic resistance on Fort Rich, but there is no contact with those groups or individuals." The doctor, impressed by her report, said, "That was very thorough." "Thanks. I'm a transcriptionist. It paid to have good instant recall." "I believe that. You doing okay?" "Okay? Are you? I mean, what does that even mean anymore? Is there okay anymore?" The police officer handed each of them a cup with some Baileys and a napkin with half a sandwich on it. He said by way of apologies, "It was the best I could do." The doctor nodded and thanked him. They ate their meal in silence, except for the unfolding news on the television and occasional sob from the bathroom. Soon, though, there was only silence other than the TV. Standing at the window, Officer Ivanov observed, "The days are already getting shorter. It's still early, but it'll be dark in a handful of hours. We staying here for the night or trying our hands at moving on to someplace else?" Emma suggested that Dana be involved in the discussion. They hadn't really checked on her in at least an hour either, so she walked to the bathroom door and knocked softly. No response. "Dana, you okay in there?" Still no response. "Dana?" Nothing. The two men were already on their feet. While Emma continued to solicit any word from inside, the doctor and police officer leaned into the door and eventually broke it from the simple and insubstantial frame. There, on the floor of the bathroom, lay Dana, apparently unable to face the events of the day, and instead elected to swallow a bottle of pills taken from the medicine cabinet and then cut her wrists with a razor blade removed from a man's razor. On the floor around her was a mixed pool of deep red blood and foamy white vomit. Dr. Caldwell dropped to his knees beside the woman and checked her heart. "I think I can hear a faint heartbeat. She barely has a pulse, but it's there." Emma laid her hand on the doctor's shoulder and said somberly, "Let her go, Doc. We don't know what she lost today. Maybe she knew that this was the best thing for her." The police officer, eyes agape, offered, "But it's a sin. We can't just sit back and let her eternal soul be damned." The doctor looked at the other man, considering what he said. Emma, however, was nonplussed by the suggestion and decided to fire back. She said, "You think it could be any worse than this? Besides, maybe she didn't buy into that story." "It doesn't matter whether she believed in the truth or not. The truth is just that, truth. Her belief or lack of it doesn't diminish that. As a Christian, Emma, chuckling lightly, said,
You can still, after all that has happened today, believe in some benevolent God sitting in the clouds on some big lazy boy recliner watching his creation unfold? That is either unshaken faith or just sheer delusion. Either way, I really don't want to hear any more of that horse shit. We got a deal? I won't belittle your mythology, and you don't thank or praise God for every goddamn thing that happens. 'Kay?
Stung, the police officer stood up and walked away. Catching the doctor's questioning look, she said,
Sorry. I guess I'll go apologize to him, too. I just have to hear that nonsense from a coworker all the time, and it drives me crazy. Everything is, we Christians think that, and we Christians believe. I just can't stand hearing it anymore, especially if the amount of time I got left here can be possibly measured in hours. I really don't want to hear any proselytizing. Is it too much to ask?
I don't know what to think anymore, Dr. Caldwell answered honestly. He was completely distracted and unable to concentrate on anything at hand. Again, he thought of his family. He was glad that his children were away at college already. They were conceivably safe and away from this horror. His concern for his wife was immense, however. Maybe she'd been able to get out before all hell had broken loose. Maybe she was able to connect with some other survivors and find themselves a good hiding spot. He doubted it, though. This thing had begun at such an early hour of the morning and spread so quickly. He wondered if it would at least be quick for her. He didn't want her to have to suffer. She didn't deserve that. She was just too good a person and too good a wife to deserve it. He also knew, though, that the kind of death that struck these victims was anything but quick and was nothing but suffering. To be gnawed and chewed and clawed and eaten was hellish. The anguish was inconceivable. He felt sick to his stomach again. They stooped there over Dana for a quiet few moments. Neither of them was sure when heart and breathing stopped, but the next time the physician checked her pulse, it was gone. Not even an echo of life. Emma disappeared for a moment and then reappeared with a sense of urgency to her step.
I think the cop flew the coop. He's gone.
He's what?
He's gone. He's nowhere down here. I went down there to apologize, and the front door was open, and he's gone.
And he's got our only gun. Emma smiled and said proudly,
That's the other thing we gotta talk about.
She raised the shoebox she was holding and said,
I found this.
In the box was a black revolver and a box of shells. It looked like a .357 Magnum, probably a Smith & Wesson. It looked big and powerful and comforting.
It was sitting on the table in the hall near the door leading to the garage. Driver probably set it down going through the door and then forgot about it.
Dr. Caldwell smiled and said, Good find, my friend. Emma smiled back and handed the box to the doctor. Loaded and in his belt, the gun did deliver a certain sense of security. He and Emma moved Dana's body to the backyard and covered her with a blue tarp. Neither of them knew Dana. They didn't even know her last name. They stood quietly after covering her and looked down at the blue plastic package. Without a word, the doctor hoisted Dana up under her shoulders and Emma grabbed her feet, each hoping that they wouldn't upset the tarp covering the expired soul beneath. They carried her further into the yard and laid her out near a small garden that was doing its best to yield a modest crop of carrots, cabbage, and lettuce, despite the cool air. Emma asked,
Should we say something?
Dr. Caldwell didn't know. He wasn't a priest. In fact, he wasn't very religious at all and couldn't recall any Bible verses to recite. He had never been that interested in church or religion. It just wasn't in his nature. He wasn't one who mocked the religious, though. And then it hit him. He looked up from the tarp-covered body and recited, Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. After a quiet few seconds, Emma said,
"Kind of nice, Doc, but kind of cold, too."
"It's the best I could do under such short notice."
Was that Shakespeare?
"Yeah, Macbeth, I think." They stood there quietly for a bit longer, Dana's quick memorial service being extended for each of them to all those they had seen fall during the day and all those that were to fall in the coming hours and days. The silence was nearly absolute. There were neither birds nor insects lending their voices to the day's choir. The doctor looked up at the woman and was going to ask what the plan was now when they both heard that stampede sound again. The sound all at once filled the void, and it was getting louder and louder by the moment. It had been an hour since Officer Ivanov had struck out on his own. Standing on the woodpile, leaning against the 7-foot cedar privacy fence, the doctor could see the man running as hard as he could, trying to get back. And immediately on his heels was a crowd of 100 or more of the beasts chasing him. Dr. Caldwell shouted at Emma to get over the fence and set out across the adjacent woods. He thought he could see other houses on the far side of the small wooded lot. Maybe they could get over there and find some safety. If the ghouls could be stalled long enough getting through the fence, perhaps they could get some distance between themselves and their pursuers. Emma didn't hesitate. She picked up a 5-gallon bucket partially filled with birdseed and covered tightly with a heavy-duty plastic lid. She set the bucket against the fence and, using it for an extra lift, hoisted herself up and over. The doctor tried to get the police officer's attention. He shouted, "Go over the fence! Use the bucket and get over the fence. We'll meet you in the woods. Don't look back. You can make it." The doctor got down from the wood and then got himself over the fence. He felt better having the storm behind him. The sound was slightly muted thanks to the houses and fences separating him from it. He saw Emma just ahead of him and increased his pace slightly to catch her. She jumped and screamed slightly as he touched her on the shoulder. They emerged in another neighborhood with another street and more houses. The sound was still thankfully behind them. They were standing in a dead-end cul-de-sac that was perhaps 5 houses deep, with 3 houses situated on the curving court. It was pretty standard suburban planning. It also looked as deserted as the area from which they had just departed. Emma, out of breath, panted.
"Looks like everyone left in a hurry."
"Yeah, a big hurry. Such a hurry that someone forgot their car." He pointed to a car that was sitting in the middle of a driveway across from them, driver's side door hanging open. Emma looked at the doctor and then at the gun tucked into his belt. Like a gunslinger walking into the OK Corral, he pulled the revolver from his belt. He pulled the eager hammer back to have the gun at the ready. He knew that it wasn't the safest way to hold the firearm, but he was comfortable with his decision. He didn't feel like he could afford any delays. With trepidation flavoring each footstep, the two of them moved forward. They arrived at the car without incident. Emma kept an eye out as the doctor checked in the car. It was a little Subaru Forester, an older model, but still in very good shape. It wouldn't be a bad car in which to make a getaway. Meanwhile, Emma heard a sound emanating from behind the closed garage door. She stepped cautiously to the door and listened. Nothing. She knocked 2 quick raps on the heavy door and waited. Her response was a rasping, guttural, ravenous groan and fingernails clawing at the other side of the closed door. She retreated from the sound as if she had been touched by something very hot or very cold. She turned and saw a disappointed doctor looking at her. "Keys?" "I'm afraid not." "What's in the garage?"
"I think it's more of those things. Maybe the folks who were loading this car. Maybe they got attacked and retreated into there with one of them already bitten. That one died, and then we know what happened. They were trapped, and there they stayed trapped."
The doctor added, "Yeah, but the real tragedy is that the keys to this rig are in the pockets of one of those things in there. Right now, this car is just a big paperweight. Unless, of course, one of us wants to go in there and get the keys."
"No, I think that—"
Emma trailed off and then continued more hopefully.
Hey, Doc, is there a purse in there?
Yeah?
Look for keys in it. Maybe the wife left hers in there for us.
Leaning in, Dr. Caldwell yelled triumphantly, "Emma, you're a fucking genius. You really are." Their celebration was cut short when the slanted front panes of glass from the house's south-facing solarium exploded outward. The shards of flying glass were followed by a thrashing and desperate ghoul, who was made all the more horrific by the dozens of cuts and deep gashes inflicted upon him by jumping through the window. He hit the still moist grass and tried to continue running, but instead slipped clumsily and fell, rolling onto the paved sidewalk. Seemingly unfazed by the misadventure, the creature leapt to its feet and was starting to run toward the doctor, who was still leaning inside the car and in shock. Emma screamed for the doctor to do something, anything. He couldn't swing himself around, though. He got his hands on the keys tightly, hooked his arm up and around, and then tossed the keys to Emma before the thing could get its hands on him. 2 quick cracks rose above the beast's bloodthirsty growl, and then the thing fell forward, its own momentum carrying it against the side of the Subaru. There, standing in the middle of the street, was Officer Ivanov, his sidearm raised and still at the ready.
"We clear? Is he dead?"
The doctor inched a little closer to make sure, and then said candidly, "He's dead enough for me. Come on, and get us the hell out of here, will ya?" Emma, furious, shouted,
What do you mean, get us out of here? It's his goddamn fault we're on the run again. Why don't you drive?
Dr. Caldwell could sense her disapproval and tried to cool the situation with simple logic. He has been professionally trained to drive in heated conditions. Am I not correct in assuming that? The officer nodded. So it merely makes sense that he should drive. Let's let each of us do what we're best at, and maybe we can all get out. Not entirely placated, but wanting to get away quickly, Emma threw open the passenger door and slumped into the seat heavily and unhappily. Dr. Caldwell climbed into the back seat, and Officer Ivanov sat in the driver's seat. The doctor watched out the back window as the first wave of their pursuers was just emerging from the unfenced yard through which the 3 of them had come. Immediately after the gunshots, there was a temporary pause in the riot sound coming from the house they had just vacated on the other side of the trees. And then the sound changed and became even more furious, as if they had been provoked by the sound, aroused. The good thing about the vehicle was that there were actually some supplies already in it. Bottled water, bread, canned foods, and several blankets were piled neatly in the trunk area, along with some beautifully decorated personalized family scrapbooks. Still fuming, Emma finally couldn't hold back anymore.
Why'd you do it? You led them right to us. Why?
Not taking his eyes from the road, he answered.
"Those things were after me. What did you want me to do? They were coming for you, too. You ought to be thankful that I shot that thing before it got the doc. Where'd you be now if that thing got him and then went after you? You'd be on foot right about now."
Nodding her head and laughing.
How many of those things did you run into while you were running back to us? I bet it was a big fat 0 because we weren't even on those things' radar. And you had to lead them right to us. We might have been able to stay there until help came for us, but now we'll never know because you led them there. What the fuck were you thinking? Did you have a fleeting thought about the jeopardy that you might be putting us in? The people that you were supposed to be protecting and serving? Or were you only thinking about your own ass?
From the back seat came, "Emma, give it a rest." He was only scared. "We're away now and maybe in better shape than staying there. We're on the move, and maybe we can find help."
Yeah, or maybe we'll just get backed into a corner, trapped.
"It's probably not that bad. Let's just figure out the best." Dr. Caldwell trailed off. Emma had turned and was facing him, and Officer Ivanov was looking at him in the rearview mirror. He exhaled a sigh. "Let's just stick together. We have to watch out for one another so that we all can get out of this. Right now it all looks bad, but we can make it if we work together." Emma nodded, but shot an accusatory glare at the police officer. Officer Ivanov didn't say a word. He looked out of the corner of his eye at the woman sitting next to him. Who was she to question him like that? He'd never let his wife speak to him like that. Of course, he and his wife were separated and hadn't spoken in years, but when they were together, you better goddamn believe that she wouldn't have been permitted to speak like that to him. He chewed his bottom lip while he imagined the things that he could have said or should have said to save face in front of that doctor. Officer Ivanov was concerned what the doctor thought of him. He didn't want to seem weak or afraid, like that woman suggested. Chapter 25. He didn't think he had been afraid, now that he thought about it. After he left the house, the doctor and that woman behind, he went out to the main road, where there were some cars here and there, but there weren't any people at all. He felt like the last man on earth. He could only think that he was feeling how Adam must have in Eden. Despite all that had happened today and all he had seen, he felt at peace. Dr. Caldwell and Emma weren't going to save that woman, Dana, from her horrible mistake. They refused her any chance at salvation because it was just more convenient for them. That woman, Emma, said it was what Dana wanted and to let her be. He was certain it was just because she didn't want to be hassled with having to help her in her time of need, and that doctor, he obviously wasn't moving to help either. Emma probably bewitched him. Officer Malachi Ivanov didn't believe in witches' spells or magical hexes, either positive or negative. His belief in the paranormal was limited to his knowledge of the Holy Ghost as part of the Trinity. He did, however, believe that there were women and even some men out there who knew how to manipulate and control others, and in so doing, these manipulators could change the minds of some very smart people just through their wiles. He could see it in the doctor's eyes already, and the doctor had no idea. So he knew that the other man was going to do exactly what she told him to do. Officer Ivanov just couldn't bring himself to stay with and protect people like that, who had no care for the immortal soul of others. So he ran. As he made his way east on the road, though, these thoughts and justifications rambling through his head, he looked out and saw a line of cars that extended several car lengths in either direction of a railroad crossing. It was then that he could hear the thunder of an approaching train. The road in that direction appeared to be blocked to vehicle traffic. He found it odd that the trains would still be running, and then began to wonder how the locomotive would get through the intersection with cars across the tracks as they were. He still couldn't see the train coming, but he could certainly hear it. It sounded as if it were coming from the north. His sense of civic duty, still a driving impulse within him, led him to start running toward the crossing to see if he might be able to move the cars himself. He ran hard, trying to close the distance between himself and the cars quickly. His surprise registered immediately on his face, and his feet struggled to stop when he realized his error. He saw the throng round the corner of the main road, which was still about a football field's length further on than the railroad tracks. The mass of people, roaring like they were going into battle, spilled across the road and the parking lot to the convenience store on the corner. In front of the bloodthirsty mob, there were 3 people who were obviously being chased by the others. The 2 men and 1 woman were strained to the point of breaking, and still they ran. One of the men took a bottle from the pack of the other. He did something to it that Officer Ivanov couldn't quite make out, and then tossed it over his shoulder without even looking. In flight, the officer could see smoke and heat waves coming from the bottle. Then it exploded on the pavement into a ball of fire. A Molotov cocktail. Maybe it would be enough to discourage the pursuit. His stomach sank, though, as the beasts simply ran through the fire as if it wasn't even there. Several of them smoldered and burned as they continued their pursuit. The Molotov cocktail thrower was falling behind the other 2. It wouldn't be long for him. The 2 survivors ran harder. They saw him. The survivors, the man and woman, spotted Officer Ivanov and screamed for him to help them. He couldn't understand their words, but he could register a sense of relief in their voices. They'd made it. Perhaps they were saved. His hand went to the pistol on his hip. He remembered that he only had 4 rounds left. What help could he possibly be? He wasn't even in control anymore. He turned, their pleas still echoing behind him, and started to run. He needed to get back to that house with the doctor and the woman again. He couldn't save the man and woman on the road, but maybe he could save the other 2. Maybe if he saved them, he might be able to save them. That woman might be willing to hear him. Maybe. He just had to run. He had to get away. He moved his legs as quickly as he could, which wasn't very fast, but the distance already between himself and the crowd helped his confidence. He stayed on the road, using the flat and predictable surface to help him maintain a consistent pace. He just had to stay in front of the locomotive sound that was forever approaching him from behind. Was this how those other people felt? He thought briefly about hunters and their prey. He thought about himself and the times that he had stalked a moose or caribou. Had they felt the same fear that was damned near paralyzing him? It was a fleeting thought that barely registered, as at the same time another thought flashed through his mind with the brightness of a neon sign. Run! Chapter 26. That was exactly what he did. He ran and ran, making his way back toward the doctor and that woman. He needed to get back to them to warn them. He owed at least that much to them. They needed to know about this flood that was approaching. Besides, there was safety in numbers, and that was why he returned. He wasn't afraid and looking out for his own hide, as Emma suggested. He was just doing his duty, and once again he was being criticized for it. Typical. He let Emma's harsh words roll off his back and tried to remind himself that women can sometimes be irrational in tense situations. His wife was an exceptional example of irrational behavior. He was guessing that Emma was too. For that reason, he tried not to take her criticism personally, knowing that it was just her fear talking. Who could blame her, really? It's just a lucky thing that he came back for them when he did. Their car screeched straight up the road until Officer Ivanov realized he had run them into another cul-de-sac without an outlet. He swung the vehicle around in the large, tear-shaped housing court and quickly found another road leading away. He was able to put some distance between them and their pursuers, but between dead-end streets, exits blocked with cars, and more cul-de-sacs, they weren't able to find a good way out of the neighborhood. Shifting their focus from trying to get away to merely trying to find some safety, they eventually elected to pull the car into a partially fenced backyard that was more or less out of sight. They hoped that being out of sight might help them to be out of mind as well. They waited for several minutes in complete silence. They barely breathed, so as not to draw attention to themselves. Their hope was that they could become invisible and simply melt away when the time was right. Dr. Caldwell handed Ivanov and Emma a bottle of water each. Emma drank from hers greedily and watched out the window intensely. Before she realized it, silent tears were spilling from the corners of her eyes. She didn't consider herself one of those emotional women that cry with the slightest provocation, so she was surprised by the tears. She wasn't even quite sure why she was crying at all. Not that she hadn't seen and felt things all day long that wouldn't justify a few tears. Officer Ivanov, still perturbed with Emma's verbal assault, finally looked over at her and saw the tears. That was more of what he expected from a woman. Vulnerability. He felt himself ease up on his feelings toward her. Maybe he was right after all. Maybe her attack on him was merely a product of a very tense situation. Maybe there was hope that she could be a good person. He undid his seatbelt and started to lean over to her as if to embrace her and comfort her. Emma's reaction was not what he expected at all. She immediately withdrew, plastering herself to the window and door of the passenger side.
That's why I don't cry. Because people like you think you can console me somehow. You look at it as a sign of weakness and think that because you sit there stoically unmoved by events, that you're somehow stronger than me and can comfort me. I may need a lot of things, but your pity isn't one of them.
Emma. Again, Dr. Caldwell tried to play the role of mediator from the back seat. She turned to face him and continued.
Try and see it from my point of view, Doc. Here's a guy who ran out on us because we hurt his feelings. Sorry, I hurt his feelings. And keep in mind that he isn't just some guy, he's a police officer. So he ran out on us and then brought bad guys back to us. And why? Because he's not willing to live by the power of his own convictions or his own pledges. I think I'm allowed a bit of a gripe with him.
Officer Ivanov, stung again, asked, "What the hell are you talking about? Convictions and pledges?"
You're a fucking cop. What were you?
The tears were coming uncontrollably now, but these tears were heated with anger and not lukewarm from despair. They filled her eyes and obscured her vision. Her frustration and resentment boiled over and took control. She couldn't even verbalize herself anymore. She did the only thing she could think to do. She got out of the car and went into the unlocked back door of the house behind which they were parked. Completely surprised, Dr. Caldwell unlocked his door and was set to get out, but the door wouldn't open. He pulled and pulled on the handle to no avail. The lock was disengaged, but the door just wouldn't open. Finally, he realized his mistake and asked, "Hey, Malachi, can you open my door from the outside, please? I think the child lock is on." Officer Ivanov, still looking in disbelief at the still open back door to the house, responded sluggishly. He scanned the yard twice, looking for any predators, and then got out. Dr. Caldwell flipped the switch on the edge of the rear door so as not to be inadvertently trapped again, and then started inside. He stopped, thinking better of it for a moment, and then asked, "You coming? I could use some backup if we run into anything in there." Looking at the car for a moment before he answered, the police officer, still trying to hide even from himself the shame that was threatening his thoughts. "Yeah, I'll be right behind you, Doc." The three of them spent a quiet several hours together in the upstairs living room of the house. The only sounds in the entire house were the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the frantic voices of impromptu news anchormen and women on the television. As night came, they decided that it would just be more prudent for them to sleep in the car, if any of them would be able to sleep at all, that is. They grabbed a few blankets from a hall closet and made themselves as comfortable as they could in the confines of the small sport utility vehicle. When any of them did sleep, it was in fits and starts. There was no real rest during any of that first night for any of them. They merely counted the hours down until sunrise the next morning. There was still something hopeful about a sunrise. Nothing really changed for them, but the sun coming up the next morning at least implied that some things could still be counted on. It was the wait for that sunrise that was the most agonizing for all of them. The longer autumn night was torturous, harboring teasing shadows and alarming sounds. Part 3, Chapter 27. Settled and comfortable enough to talk for a moment, the survivors in the boarded-up house sat together in the living room. At first, the only sound was a collective sigh of relief. The room was filled with questions, though no one spoke. They looked at one another, not knowing where or how to begin. Megan broke the stalemate. She asked, quite simply, "What is going on out there?" Everyone's eyes looked from one to the other until all eyes were looking at Jerry. He didn't like this one bit. He wasn't accustomed to being the guy with the answers. Besides, he wasn't entirely sure that his answer was the right one. What happened if what he thought he knew was actually wrong? And even if he wasn't wrong, could he believe it either? He was thinking those exact thoughts when he began to speak.
You all have got to understand that I'm no authority on anything, really. I'm a high school dropout who went back to school to get my GED and some training so that I could get a job. That's all. I don't have a degree in nothing. I'm just a nurse's aide. I don't know a lot. But what I do know is movies, video games, books, and music.
Neil thought to himself that he could tell already that he liked this kid. That list of interests just secured the deal. Neil was also fairly certain that the kid wasn't the dullard that he was painting himself to be, though. Jerry may have lacked confidence, but he wasn't intellectually impaired. Jerry continued,
I think what we may be dealing with out there are zombies.
Kim, leaning against the wall, stood upright and asked,
You mean those monsters that gotta eat brains and walk around